What would the world look like if Ronald Reagan hadn't been shot in 1981? What about if the Muppets were bought by Disney? Yeah, bit of a strange one that. What if Hannibal was more successful in his fight against the Romans? Or if Sony had never got into the video game console making market, who would still be making consoles in today's age? There are an absolute ton of alternate timelines, outcomes, histories in this iceberg. So without further ado, grab a drink. My choice today is Taiwanese milk tea, and join me as we explore the alternate histories iceberg. And I hope you like my hat. If you know where it's from, let me know in the comments below. But continuing on from tier 11, we have a different flesh. So this is actually a bunch of different timelines all written under this one book, and this one book is a different flesh. And all of these individual stories are all connected in some way, and that way is exploring the idea of what if Homo erectus, some of our distant ancestors, actually survived to the modern day along with Homo sapiens. It's a pretty cool book. It was written by our main man of alternate histories, Harry Turtledove, which it seems like that's just all he did, write alternate timelines, or alternate histories technically. And in this timeline, the Americas more or less are inhabited by these Homo erectus, and like Europe, Africa, Asia, that sort of area is still inhabited by Homo sapiens. And throughout these different stories, they cover the colonization of the Americas more or less, but we're colonizing Homo erectus instead of Homo sapiens. And things tend to be a little more difficult to conquer in this alternate timeline. And to help kind of patch the different stories together, there is this in-universe textbook that kind of explains what's going on in between these different stories. The Homo erectus are referred to as Sims by the Homo sapiens, and they're basically a more simple, unintelligent form of Homo sapiens. And because of this divide, there are a few things that happen kind of differently or at different times in this alternate timeline. Like, for instance, the theory of evolution gets developed like 100 years earlier, probably because we see the similarities between, us and the Homo erectus. The steam engine gets developed a little bit sooner. There are a bunch of different ancient animals still alive in this timeline. There are spearfang cats, which just sounds super cool. There are woolly mammoths. And actually, one good thing about this discovery of these Sims is that they are basically responsible for eradicating slavery among Homo sapiens, but not necessarily for the best reasons. The way they argue it in the story is that these Sims are so basic-minded, they're so simplistic, that it doesn't really make sense for sapiens to enslave other sapiens, but really we should just enslave these Sims and have all humans go free. Don't ask me, I didn't write it. The stories basically take us through the 1800s, 1900s, up to the 2000s even, and a major plot point through all of this is like, how should we treat these Sims? Are they closer to animals or apes sort of thing? Or are they close enough to humans to, warrant human rights? And I quite like this timeline, I quite like this story, because it is a super interesting thing to think about that has been explored in, other timelines, but it's been explored with stuff like Neanderthals. And I guess the general question is the same of what would the world really look like if something other than Homo sapiens had actually survived to this modern day. At the moment we kind of divide everyone by gender or race, but we are all still one species. But what if you could also divide people by, the Neanderthals who live over there and us humans who live in another part of the world? And by the end of these stories, it basically becomes like they're closer and closer to having rights. Like, they're never really seen as full humans or that they can ever become humans, but they conclude that they should still have, respect and rights, just not, full human rights, citizen rights, that sort of thing. So yeah, a pretty cool one. Our Struggle is a alternate history on our favorite alternate history website, aptly named alternatehistory.com. And this explores the question of what if the bad guy from World War II, and I know there was a lot of bad guys, but the main bad guy, because I'm not too sure if saying his name on YouTube will get it demonetized, which is incredibly silly, but it is what it is. But in our timeline, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which translates into My Struggle. But this timeline explores the idea of what if he was communist. And so it's a, play on words for my struggle to be our struggle, because it's communist. But yeah, it is a pretty wild story. It basically takes us through his entire early life, when he was a kid, as he's growing up, as he's getting more and more into art in particular. And then he's kind of transitioned from artist to learning about politics and different philosophies, and then eventually into his, political dictatorship days. It does bring up some interesting questions about if he were communist, whether he would have even been able to get into power at all. Most of the entire Western world was generally fighting communism back then, and so America, the UK, France, etc. would have been massively opposed to communism, and so I think they would have fought his rise to power even more than they actually did before World War II. On top of that, the German people themselves were generally against communism, as were the other German politicians, the German army, etc. So that's the first problem, in that he likely would have never really gotten into the power position that he was if he instead was a communist. The timeline also tracks his journey through World War I, and whereas in our timeline he had a particular hatred for the Jewish people, in this alternate timeline, because of his kind of communist, vision, he has a more generalized hatred, I guess, not just for the Jewish people in particular, but also rich people, also business owners, politicians, anyone that generally communists were against. He was also naturally against them. And as he's getting more and more kind of political power, he's preaching about how stuff like the military is so inept and so useless, more or less because it's run by the powerful people, and that it would be a much better force, a much better system, if it were run not by the leaders, but by the common man, the general population, the people. This timeline then goes on to explore if he, did somehow get into power, how other countries would react to this. And for example, it posits that Italy wouldn't have been too friendly towards them. They kind of teamed up in our timeline, but a fascist Mussolini of Italy would kind of be an enemy of communist Germany, not an ally. And Stalin in Russia was kind of unlikely to team up with, Germany, because even though they were both communist states, the timeline posits that both of their egos would have likely got in the way. They were both big, powerful, inspiring figures, and don't get me wrong, they were both very evil, but they did inspire lots of people to, do evil things. So two big figureheads like that working together somehow and not taking each other's limelight is thought to be very unlikely in this timeline. So yeah, there is a absolute ton of reading material in this timeline. As I said, to summarize it, it would have been very difficult for him to get into power in the first place. Even if he did get into power, there would have been a much greater backlash against him. The countries that were against him would have probably been even more against him. The countries that were with him might not have even been with him in the first place. And the other communist states like the USSR also might not have, gone along with him, teamed up with him. So although it is a pretty different, a pretty interesting timeline, communist Germany probably wouldn't have worked out. The North Star is red. So this is a timeline in which FDR doesn't replace Henry Wallace as his vice president, and this is in his 4th term, but instead actually keeps him on as vice president. So what happened in our timeline, and this was actually before presidential term limits, so you could, in theory, technically, run for president as many times as you wanted, and actually, serve as president. But this was like a long-standing kind of tradition, kind of manners sort of thing, where people would only serve for 2 terms, but it wasn't actually written into law anywhere. And I think even if it wasn't a standard thing to only run for 2 terms, a lot of the previous presidents, even if they did run later on, most of them probably wouldn't have won these re-elections. But it wasn't really done until the start of World War II, or, just before it. But, as we all know, FDR ran and actually won the presidency 2 times with John Garner as his vice president. Then he changed to Wallace as his vice president for his 3rd term. And then he actually ran again for a 4th term, this time removing Wallace and instead having his vice president as Truman. And he actually won that election as well. So he's run and won 4 different elections. He did really kind of only serve 3 terms because he died less than a year into his 4th term. So he served 3 full terms and then little bit of his 4th term, but it is still impressive regardless. But as I said, this timeline basically asked the question of what would the world look like, what would be different if FDR had kept on Wallace as his vice president during his 4th term instead of switching to Truman. So as you all know, if the president dies while he's in the presidency, then what happens is the vice president takes over for the rest of his term. So with FDR dying only 1 year into his term, we basically got a Truman presidency for the next 3 years. So what this timeline is basically asking is, what would the world look like if Wallace was the president for these 3 years instead of Truman? And honestly, quite a bit is changed just from this one, flip of power. First of all, only one nuclear bomb was dropped in Japan, and because of many other reasons, Japan kind of goes the way of Korea, where the communists take over from the north and the Western powers take over from the south, and now in the modern day in this timeline, you have North and South Japan. And in China, in our timeline, the people who used to rule China, the KMT, they lost the war, they went over and formed Taiwan, and the CCP, the Communist Party of China, basically took over all of China. But in this timeline, it's kind of a stalemate sort of thing. And what happens is KMT, instead of all going over to Taiwan, they basically just have this half of China, with the Communist Party keeping the other half. So Japan is split in two, China itself is split in two, and Korea basically goes through what China went through in our timeline, where the northern communists end up winning the war completely. They take over the entirety of Korea, the entire peninsula, and the South Koreans are the ones who have to flee to an island, and they form like basically the Korean version of Taiwan. Russia are actually the ones who land the first man on the moon. There are a bunch of nukes dropped in northern China, in Russia, in Sweden, and there are a ton of countries, a ton of powers, too many to list here, that either, lose a bit of power, gain a bit of power, a bit of land here and there, and it ends up in a honestly vastly different world, all really from one decision that FDR made to, keep one guy on the ticket instead of replacing him with another. So there you go. 1862. So this is an alternate timeline written by our second or maybe third favorite alternate history writer, Robert Conroy, who also wrote stuff like 1901. He had a thing for writing, numbers or dates as his titles, which, whatever. But 1862 explores a world where the British basically joined the American Civil War on the side of the Confederate South. So in our timeline, the UK was fairly standard, kind of neutral between the whole Civil War. Like, officially they were neutral, but even practically they were more or less neutral. They supported the North with some trade and munitions, ammo, weapons sort of thing, but it wasn't too many. And they also helped support the South in many ways. Munitions, ammo. I don't know if munitions and ammo are the same thing, but they did a trade deal with the South as well. They even had 2 warships built for the South. So like, all in all, they were pretty, down the middle. But in this timeline, the US basically captures some Confederates on board a British ship. The Brits end up getting mad, chaos ensues, and the Brits join the war on the side of the Confederacy. Confederacy. Now, there are spoilers ahead in case you think this timeline sounds like super cool and you might want to read it. But even though the Brits and the South start off pretty strong, they win a few battles, they push for some more ground, they are slowly beaten back, they are slowly beaten as a coalition, and the Brits basically end up surrendering or suing for peace or whatever, and the Civil War actually ends 2 years before it ended in our timeline. So even though the South had the support of the Brits in this timeline, even still they lose the war 2 years sooner than they actually did, which, it might be because after the Brits surrender, they do go over to the North and end up actually joining the North and fighting against the South, which probably accelerated their loss. Maybe that had something to do with it, who knows. Anyway, John Wilkes Booth is arrested and stopped before he can actually assassinate Abe Lincoln. But since this was actually 2 years before Abe Lincoln was assassinated, because, the South lost 2 years sooner, this was before the full plot to assassinate him had taken place. US. So yeah, Abe Lincoln gets to serve out his full term as president. A pretty cool timeline, I think, and it is a pretty nice read of a story. Watchmen is one of the most well-written, one of the most famous, I'd say, slightly strange comics, and it was written by a man called Alan Moore and published by DC Comics, which DC really just means Detective Comics, so it was published by Detective Comics. But anyway, Watchmen basically explores a world where superheroes do actually exist, or at least super-powered individuals, and they are basically discovered in the 1940s, and due to this, America wins the Vietnam War because, you know, they have superheroes on their side. There are also a few, you know, other minor changes, and come the 1980s, the US is at war with the USSR. They're kind of close to World War III, it's very scary stuff, and being a superhero or super-powered individual is basically illegal. Like, you can't just go around and, you know, do your own work or be a vigilante. If you are a superhero, you basically need to work for the government. And there are a bunch of the older generation of superheroes, like from the 40s and 50s, that are either retired now or do actually work for the government. And the story basically follows this detective style narrative where they're investigating the murder of this quite important superhero. And I won't spoil too much of it, as it is a fantastic alternate history, alternate timeline, comic series, whatever you want to call it. But I do highly recommend you checking it out if you have the time. Comics are always super quick to read. They're visual, they're graphical, they're very cool. It is unique. It is very creative. It's a classic. Don't know why I said that weird. But yeah, even the storytelling in these is kind of quite creative. Like, they don't follow necessarily a linear timeline. They sometimes, you know, jump back and forth between different events, different times, different characters, and it is, yeah, just a lot of fun to read. So yeah, think of this like the classic, the original Boys or something, and as I said, check it out if you have the time. The Silver Knight. So to understand this timeline, we need to go all the way back to the medieval state of Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and of course, Russia. So this is a map of the general area of the 1400s, and while the point of divergence technically occurs like 100 years before this map, I think this map is super helpful in generally showing roughly how Europe was laid out at the time, and how broken up a lot of the modern countries actually were back then. You know, they weren't this giant united country. And yeah, so this is useful, I think, for showing roughly how everything was back in those times. So anyway, in our timeline, Lithuania, this tiny little country here, basically started taking over Europe, and at the height of its power was actually the largest country or state in Europe. But it wasn't able to conquer the city of Moscow, and so it was basically just content with all of this European land over here. And in our timeline, at least part of the reason why Lithuania couldn't conquer Moscow was due to Moscow replacing the old wooden Kremlin with a new stone Kremlin. So the Kremlin in, you know, our modern world in 2024 is this huge building, set of buildings, whatever. But back when it was originally made, it was actually just made out of wood. But it was actually relatively close to this invasion by Lithuania. It was replaced by a stone Kremlin because they thought the wooden Kremlin would be too easy to, you know, conquer, to take over. And so they made it a bit stronger. They added, you know, more defensive features. And so when Lithuania came over, they weren't actually able to conquer Moscow. But in this alternate timeline, the stone Kremlin change was never made. It was still made out of wood, and this actually enabled Lithuania to take over Moscow. This timeline is absolutely huge. There is a ton to read through, and it spans over, you know, roughly 600 years. The Lithuanians take over Moscow. They start slowly taking over what we know of as Russia today. And because this was quite far back, because it was quite, you know, impactful, there are quite a few modern changes that have happened, or modern differences, just because of this one change. The English actually win the 100-Year War, which was originally won by the French, and this English win ends in a English, French, or Franco joint kingdom sort of thing. The Lithuanian-Polish Union ends up also falling through, and this quite massively changes things in Europe. And since Italy is in Europe. This also changes Italy, which changes a bunch of the explorers of that time. You know, people like Columbus, people like Vespucci. And so since they were changed, a bunch of stuff in the Americas was also changed. And America isn't even called America, it's called Vespuccia. And this is because of a minor difference. America that we know of today, you know, the entire continent, the country, whatever, that was named after the Amerigo in Amerigo Vespucci, who was one of the early explorers. And so with these minor changes that have happened, it's still named after Amerigo Vespucci, but for some reason they used his last name instead of his first name, and so this entire continent is known as Vespuccia. There's a movement, philosophy, religion sort of thing called Unitarianism in this timeline, which is kind of like a socialism, communism, globalism hybrid sort of thing, saying that every nation should be, you know, united for the greater good. And the Lithuanians basically developed something called revivalism in the 1900s, preaching the superiority of the Lithuanian race and using a certain symbol, which I won't show you here, but I'm sure you can imagine what it is. And it's a bit on the nose for an analogy, I think, this one. And in a very strange kind of series of events, in this timeline, there is developed something akin to our United Nations in, you know, our timeline. But instead of the United Nations, they call it the United States. And this, you know, United Nations equivalent was founded by the Italian Prime Minister, Amerigo Togliatti. And so, since his name is Amerigo, this is sometimes referred to as the United States of America because of Amerigo. So yeah, very strange. You do have the United States of America in this timeline, but it is like a worldwide thing named after someone completely different, but it is kind of a cool writing analogy idea. Kaiserredux is a pretty cool one, quite honestly. So we've covered a little higher up in the iceberg the Hearts of Iron game, a pretty cool simulation sort of game where you can play as almost any country in the world, and you can do stuff like start wars, have alternate histories, alternate decisions through history, and yeah, it's kind of like Alt History, the video game, I guess. And then there was something called Kaiserreich, which we covered. And this was basically a mod for Hearts of Iron, which kind of explored scenarios about what would have happened if the Central Powers, so Germany, Bulgaria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, what if they had potentially won World War I instead of the Allied powers? Which, that is a pretty fun mod. But Kaiserredux goes one step further, and this is kind of like a mod for Kaiserreich, which in itself is a mod for Hearts of Iron. So modception, apparently. And Kaiserredux basically started off as something akin to a helper mod. So, you know, it gathered a bunch of these mods, put it into one package so you can just install one mod and you don't need to worry about compatibility issues or anything like that. But basically over time it started to work on its own stuff aside from Kaiserreich, and today is basically just a standalone mod that has even more stuff in it than Kaiserreich. It even has a bunch of stuff that was actually removed from Kaiserreich, and Kaiserredux was like, that was actually pretty cool, so we're just gonna add it back in. So yeah, it's a super cool mod. You can do stuff like skipping the entire US Civil War. You can run through a timeline of the KKK running the United States. There are some darker parts, even darker than that, if you can imagine, of a creepy New England inspired by like H.P. Lovecraft sort of monsters, which sounds super cool. But yeah, there are some dark stuff that you can explore in this mod. And as well as skipping the US Civil War, you can also start your own second Civil War with options such as New York, Texas, or Alaska receding or seceding from the United States. So yeah, a super cool mod for a very cool game, and I would highly recommend checking it out. A hippie in the House of Mouse. So the hippie in this timeline refers to Jim Henson, who was the creator of the Muppets, and the House of Mouse refers to, of course, Disney. You know, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, that sort of thing. Now, in our timeline, Jim was actually looking to sell the Muppets to Disney, and this was for him a way to to make a bit of money from the Muppets, to take the Muppets off his hands so he could focus his time and energies on working on some other projects that he had. And this wasn't an easy decision for him because these were kind of like, his children sort of thing. But he did try to make the deal. It never did actually end up going through. And that all led to the timeline that we currently have. But what if Jim had approached Disney sooner and perhaps raised enough money to purchase, say, 10% of their stocks and secure himself a seat on the Disney board? Well, that is what a hippie in the House of Mouse explores. It starts off in 1979 with Jim getting the idea to sell the Muppets to Disney a whole 10 years sooner than he actually did in our timeline. And as I said, he becomes a board member. The deal finally gets made, it goes through, and there are a ton of changes compared to our timeline. And I won't go through all of them, as there are honestly just loads of them. A lot of them involve minor changes in media, really. So like films coming out a year or two either earlier or sooner. Those are the same thing, either earlier or later than in our timeline. Or minor changes like A Bug's Life being instead called just Bug's Life in this timeline, to even minor character changes in films or shows. Like, for example, in Bug's Life, there is a singing praying mantis called Trap, and it's voiced by Julie Andrews, because Trap, the Von Trapp family, Sound of Music, Julie Andrews, it's all very clever stuff. Cartoon Network is instead called Cartoon TV. Sonic the Hedgehog is actually called Astro the Armadillo in this timeline, which I thought was absolutely hilarious, and we should absolutely change it to that in our timeline. So yeah, as I said, a bunch of minor name changes. Toy Story is called The Secret Life of Toys. Always Sunny is replaced with The Kids Are Alright. And get this, Samuel L. Jackson stars in a documentary, not about himself, but about snakes, where he goes out into the desert, explores snakes, and the documentary is called Snakes on the Plain. Like plain as in desert. Yeah, just incredible. It is quite an interesting look into how Jim Henson might have, affected Hollywood, affected Disney, affected cartoons. And honestly, if you enjoy old history, if you enjoy movies, TVs, especially media, that sort of thing, this is an incredible read and I would highly recommend checking it out. It's less about wars and ancient kings and kingdoms and death and blood and that sort of thing, and more about, as I said, just quirky media, TV, shows, films, and about the changes that might have happened. It's quite lighthearted, it's quite creative and fun, so yeah. If you got the time, definitely check it out. Pax Romana is a comic book alternate timeline where the Vatican in the modern age discovers, invents, however you want to phrase it, time travel, which yeah, so naturally the Vatican gathers a bunch of weapons, a bunch of soldiers, they send them all back in time to 312 AD, and things quite expectantly go a bit wild. The whole plan more or less is to go back in time to strengthen the Catholic Church, and so in the future they are just a more powerful force, they're a more rich force, and that is basically the plan. But things don't necessarily go as they had envisioned. The cardinal who was sent back in time along with, all the other people, the cardinal ends up getting shot and killed. I mean, somehow they mess that up, they go back with future knowledge, with future weapons and gear, and they somehow end up getting shot in 300 AD, but whatever. But it's a pretty cool concept all round, I think. Again, if you like time travel, which I personally tend to like it, then this does make for quite an exciting, quite an interesting read. But as always, if you're looking for a hyper-realistic what-if scenario, imagining what if the Vatican invented time travel might not exactly be what you're looking for. An Age of Miracles, the revival of Ramayan. So this is a bit of a niche one, and as often happens, to explore it, we need to go back in time. This time to the 1200s, where Theodore II Ducas Lascaris, or Teddy as his friends called him, ruled as the Emperor of Nicaea, and he ruled for 4 years after taking over from his father, John III Ducas Vatatzes. Now, Theodore only served for 4 years because he suffered quite badly from epilepsy, which likely led to his early death and at least hindered his ruling, his ruling years just before his death. So he basically wasn't able to really rule effectively. Now, for a bit of background to this background, around this time you had the Ottoman Empire roughly here, the Orthodox Christians roughly here, and this was basically the remains of the Roman Empire. We call them the Byzantine Empire, but they actually called themselves at the time the Roman Empire. And then you have the Roman Christians, led by the Roman Catholic Church here. Now, this is a tiny bit confusing, so please forgive me, but around this time you had a ton of crusades going on all around the Mediterranean, a bunch in the Middle East sort of area, still like the Mediterranean sort of Middle East. And these were often between Christians and Muslims, between the Holy Lands, between like Egypt, Jerusalem, that sort of area. And there was one particular crusade which is super important to this timeline, as it was just so pivotal. Now, for a long story short, when this crusade was originally planned and started, it was supposed to be a crusade against Egypt and Jerusalem, more or less. It was started in Italy, but for a multitude of reasons, the, Crusaders were a mixture of convinced and bought out, and they were instead directed to Constantinople. And Constantinople, at this particular point in time, was the richest Christian city in the entire world. It was, Orthodox Christians, to be fair, not the same Christians as were in Rome, but still, when the Pope found out that this was, going on, that this had happened, he was completely appalled. He had basically lost control of his crusade and said it was terrible, it shouldn't be happening, we shouldn't be attacking fellow Christians. Our real fight should be in the Middle East, or, the Holy Lands. But it happened anyway. Constantinople was basically conquered and or sacked, and the Orthodox Christians that were inhabiting Constantinople, a bunch of them died, a bunch of them lost their homes, lost their possessions, and what remained of them basically split up and traveled north, and they formed 3 new states, being Epirus, Trebizond, and Nicaea. And that is where this timeline more or less splits. So the idea was the Greeks more or less lost control of Constantinople after the sacking of it, and they ended up splitting up. They went north, they formed these 3 other states, and in our timeline they did end up coming back and reconquering Constantinople, but they never really got back to their former glory, their former power, and so later on, when the Ottomans became powerful, they were able to, invade Constantinople and kind of put an end to the Roman Empire for good. But what if, this timeline posits, what if Teddy did not have epilepsy? Well, that would mean that he probably wouldn't have died when he died, and that his rule would have been stronger, more effective, while he was actually still alive. Well, the timeline is, I think, super fascinating if you want to read it yourselves. It goes into a fair amount of detail and history, but the idea is that instead of Nicaea retaking Constantinople themselves, as they did in our timeline, and then, being weaker and then slowly collapsing like a flan in a cupboard, instead of that, what if Nicaea just basically ignored Constantinople? They had the leadership and direction of Teddy. What if they first reconquered and reunited the parts of them that had split off, and then, instead of going down into Constantinople, they pushed further west, taking over more and more of the kind of Europe area, then eventually into Italy, and then down south into Rome, and actually have the Roman Empire once again reconquer Rome, or at least, occupy and own Rome. And this timeline basically takes us through all of that and develops them up as almost like the former Roman Empire. Now they own all of Italy, they own a bit of Europe, they own that east side sort of thing, and then they move slowly eastwards once again. They reconquer Greece. But what if they do all of that, and then by the time the Ottomans come over and originally conquer Constantinople quite easily, by this series of events, the Roman Empire is, super powerful, they're at their former glory, if not stronger than their former glory, and they are able to quite easily reconquer Constantinople and push the Muslims, push the Ottoman Empire even further back than they did in our timeline, which, was not at all. And the Ottoman Empire actually retreats as far back as Iran. And the timeline basically reads out like they stayed super strong and maintained the empire for at least a few hundred more years. So a really cool cool timeline, a really cool alt history, I think. Definitely check it out if you like the sound of it. It is very well written, very well researched, and I did quite enjoy it myself. Jackboots in Whitehall is an alternate history where Germany is seemingly more powerful in World War II and actually manages to invade the British Isles. It is a film, it is a British film, it is partly animated, partly done with puppets, and as far as films go, it's not insanely serious, it's quite humorous in ways, sometimes in a dark way, and it explores, as I said, this timeline where Germany basically invades Britain by digging under the English Channel and then popping up underneath Whitehall in London. So very historically accurate, clearly. And yeah, they invade this way, the Brits are fighting them off, the Brits end up actually having to retreat more and more north, and the day is eventually saved by some legends who come down from Scotland. So a great film if you want a silly, light-hearted, humorous sort of historical what-if. Very unrealistic historically, as you can tell, but yeah, still a great one. The Protect and Survive series. So the original Protect and Survive series was firstly a pamphlet document style booklet that was released in the 1970s with the aim of basically educating the public on what to expect, what to do, etc. during the event of a nuclear bomb. It was how to tell the signs of one, what to do for yourself and your family after one goes off, even before one goes off if you get like a warning, and how to take care of yourself to survive after the fact. This pamphlet was then adapted later on into 20 short episodes of a series, like 20 video episodes, and these were, you know, super short clips basically putting the information from a booklet pamphlet onto, you know, the big screen or the small black and white screen. And this is where the inspiration for this alternate timeline comes from. And this alternate timeline was written in 2010. It was called Protect and Survive, and it is pretty fantastic, if not a little bit depressing. Some say depressing, some say realistic, although they might actually be the same thing in this case. But the first alternate timeline basically just explored Britain and explored a bomb going off and what that meant for the people on the island in Britain, what that meant for Europe. As I said, it's a very dark, depressing, but still realistic timeline. And I think, in my opinion, a pretty realistic showcase of what actually might happen during or after a nuclear bomb goes off. You know, you have the obvious things like the explosion, the damage, the radiation, but also the political and social civilian side of it as well. You know, what might the army do in this case? What might the Queen do? Do the politicians stay in power? Do they go home to their families? Does anyone even try and maintain order or maintain power? What do the civilians do? Do they maintain peace? Do they go around killing each other, stealing food? You know, and this timeline basically lays that all out. But the timeline doesn't end there. Well, I mean, it kind of did, but there were many alternate spin-off timelines that were made with the blessing of the original timeline, where they explored basically the same universe, the same timeline, but were made by different writers. They explored different parts of the world, different scenarios. Some were more personal with stuff like names and characters. Some were more, you know, detached in a way. There were some that explored America. There were others that explored Europe, you know, different parts of Europe. There were others that explored the Soviets, and there were also some that also explored Britain, but just, you know, a different timeline in a different style perhaps. So it's a super cool, as I said, collection of timelines that all seem to have a slightly different style but are aimed at the same goal. And it kind of reminds me in ways of something like the Fallout series, where you have the same event that takes place, the same nuclear war, but throughout different games it's told in, like, you know, slightly different ways, slightly different parts of the world. But yeah, as I said, super cool series. It is, pre-warning, quite dark, quite realistic, brutal, horrific, but that is unfortunately the realities of a nuclear war. So yeah, maybe don't read this one before bed, but definitely check it out if you like that sort of thing. The Belisarius Series. And this explores a world where this is one of the more fantasy series timelines, I guess, which if you want a hyper-realistic historical one, this might not be the one for you. But in this timeline, which is set partly in the far distant future, there are basically two major factions fighting a worldwide Great War. And on one side, you have the Great Ones, which consist basically of, like, robots. And the other side are the New Gods, and they basically represent cyborgs, or at least they're made up of cyborgs. So partly human, partly, you know, robotic. And the whole idea is that both of them have moved past humanity in their own ways. And yeah, they're far in the future, they're fighting a war between each other, and they both time travel back to the 500-600 AD sort of time. And their goal is to basically try and shift and shape the past in order to more greatly benefit their faction in the future. The old gods send back, among many other things, a cyborg named Link. And Link goes back to the Malwa Empire in India. And these are, I think, the bad guys. They're fighting for stuff like purity, like eugenics, like global, you know, takeover, global dominance. And the Great Ones send back a super cool AI named Aid, and Aid instead goes back to the Romans, more specifically to help someone called Flavius Belisarius, who was widely considered to be one of the greatest generals in the Byzantine Empire. So these two ancient empires, the Malwa and the Romans, are kind of fighting a proxy war for these two, you know, futuristic empires, and the future of the entire world, I guess, depends on it. So as I said, not a super realistic alternate timeline, but at least for me, it is a super fun one. Wargame Series. So this is a series of 3 games from 2012 to 2014 that allow you to explore kind of alternate histories, alternate timelines between countries through the medium, basically, of war. Kind of similar to Hearts of Iron in a way. And the first one, European Escalation, takes place in a world of the 1970s and 80s, and it focuses on NATO, on the Warsaw Pact, so like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and of course the Soviet Union. You can play a bunch of different scenarios and missions and operations, and it's not the most depth alternate history in terms of, you know, actually changing timelines, which I guess Hearts of Iron is better in ways in that regard, but it is still a super well designed, super fun to play, strategic, you know, war game in which you can, as I said, play through some different scenarios that didn't actually happen in our world. The second game in the series, Air-Land Battle, also takes place around the same time. It also takes place in Europe, so you've got, you know, NATO and all those other countries we mentioned before, but this one also kind of focuses on Northern Europe, so, you know, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, that sort of thing. And the third game, Red Dragon, takes place slightly after these other 2 games, and this takes place in East Asia instead of Europe. And in this last timeline, it is one where the Cold War actually has never ended and the Soviet Union hasn't yet collapsed. And so yeah, you're playing in a Soviet era, or rather more modern era Soviet Cold War. And yeah, as I said, if you like history, if you like real-time strategy games, you know, war games, that sort of thing, and maybe you're fed up of playing the standard World War II, World War I battles, scenarios, wars, then absolutely check this one out. 1882 Custer in Chains. Now, this shouldn't be confused with Custard, which I am really craving right now, but this is a timeline written by our favorite author, Robert Conroy, as you can tell by his naming convention of naming his timelines and books after dates for some reason. I guess just naming it the year it took place is good enough for him. But this takes place in a alternate history America and starts off in 1876 during the Great Sioux War, which was basically a war over the Black Hills of Dakota. It was a great area full of lumber. There were great vantage points from the top of it. It was super essential to, you know, control and own. There was gold in the hills. And so when the settlers, you know, got to the area, when they saw these hills, they realized how much they wanted them, and they were occupied at the time by a particular American Indian tribe. And this particular tribe that currently, you know, owned the hills, they had actually fought off other American Indian tribes in order to conquer it, essentially. So even the American Indians that were here, they were kind of colonizers of other American Indians that used to own the hills. And so there was a lot of fighting going on over who can maintain power and, you know, occupation over these hills. And at the time, as part of a contract with the United States government, they had basically said to everyone, look, only American Indians are allowed in these mountains, in these hills. And they basically stopped and went after people who went out there trying to camp, trying to have land of their own there, if they weren't American Indian. But in 1874, there was an expedition sent out there. They discovered that there was gold in these hills. And soon that information, you know, kind of spread nationwide. Everyone and their mothers was coming down here to try and get some of this gold. And it's kind of mad. They came from like all over the US, from like far and wide, and they came here with picks, with shovels, trying to prospect and mine for this gold. And the US, you know, military, the US Guard had to actually come in and prevent people, you know, settling in these hills. And yeah, eventually it was just, there was too many people coming in from everywhere. So a few of these chiefs of some of these local American Indian tribes, they went down personally down to Washington, and they, you know, told them off, essentially said, you know, we have an agreement, do your work, get these people off our land. And the Congress basically said, that sounds like a lot of work. How about we just pay you this money? And that is basically us buying these hills of Dakota, and then we can move you and your people all to another Native American area. And, you know, everyone is happy, sort of thing. But the chiefs, quite rightly I think, said, no, this is our land. We just want to chill here and be happy. We don't want to move to some other area. And they were like, oh yeah, you know, these North Dakota hills, it's not even like that great of an area. We have an amazing area out in Oklahoma. Like, you would really enjoy it. How about you just go out there, live your life? And of course, the chiefs were like, if the area is so great, why don't you just go live over there? And eventually, after all this, no official agreement was made. And then these chiefs went back to their tribes, and they were all super annoyed at, you know, the Congress, at the government. And then the US went in there and tried to get some of these chiefs, some of these tribes to, you know, surrender or to submit. They, of course, said no. And then this started the Great Sioux War. Long story short, these tribes fought quite hard. They actually won a battle or two against the Americans, but eventually they did lose the war. And in one of these battles, the Battle of Little Bighorn, there was a man who was killed named Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. And he was actually one of the first people in charge of these expeditions to the Black Hills. And so, after that very long history lesson, this alternate timeline basically says, what would the world look like if Custer hadn't died in that battle? Well, even after he died in our timeline in that battle, he was still considered and revered one of the greater, you know, fighting forces, one of the greater leaders in America at the time. And so this says that in this alternate timeline, if he were actually to survive this Sioux War, he would likely be revered even more so. And in this alt timeline, he runs for the presidency in 1980 or in 1880, and he actually wins. So with Custer as president, he installs National Custard Day, where everyone gets a free bowl of custard. I don't know how many more jokes I can get out of custard. But this says that because of Custer's personality, you know, he's always looking to push forward and to win and to conquer in a way, or explore, as some would see it, that in looking for new things to explore and conquer, he actually finds it in the Spanish Empire of South America. So he ends up sending a bunch of soldiers and ships down to South America, you know, to explore more land, to conquer some of these Spanish lands maybe. And the people and ships he sends down are subsequently killed and destroyed, and it hints that this might be the start of a new Great War, you know, between the relatively young United States and the Spanish Empire. So a pretty cool story, quite honestly. I do love these more historical based ones where I get to learn a bit of actual history, as you soon come to realize when learning about history like this, that there is obviously an absolute ton of history out there. Because say, even if you learn about the Great Sioux War, this was one slice of time that happened in this one particular area in America. And so even at this exact time, you probably have 1,000 other interesting, super interesting tales that happened in South America, in the Spanish Empire, in China, Europe. And so there's, yeah, just honestly too much to learn. But yeah, a cool timeline, a pretty fun one, a historically based one, and honestly goes to show just how much could change, or that could have changed, if something as minor as this was actually different. Germanica is another timeline written by Robert Conroy that is not in the form of a date, but is actually one of the last books that he ever wrote, as he himself actually died shortly after this book was released. But anyway, Germanica asks the super commonly thought about question and scenario, I think, of what if in World War II Germany didn't surrender, but instead basically moved to the Alps and started a base in the Alps, in the mountains, where they stayed there and built up this, legion, this army of super fanatics, hardcore warriors, super soldiers, and then to one day take back Europe once again. Which, I ask myself that question every single day. But yeah, a fairly interesting one. I think even if this particular scenario isn't very likely, it maybe at least explores the question of what if Germany didn't surrender, if they didn't lose so quickly, if the war maybe dragged out for another year, 2, 3, 5, how exactly would the rest of the war, the rest of the decade actually gone? Could the exhausted, Allied forces actually have kept fighting for years? Would they have run out of resources, of ammo, of supplies, food, fuel, that sort of thing? Would it simply not have mattered? Would the Allied forces have just chased Germany into the Alps and finished them off? These are great questions, and honestly, it reads as a great timeline. Red Inferno, 1945. So this is another Robert Conroy timeline, where the USSR basically just goes a bit nutty. In our timeline, this, more or less kind of played out as planned. You obviously had East Germany and West Germany for a while, but that was eventually reunited. So as World War II is coming to a close, the Allies and the Soviets basically agreed to, divvy up Germany and Berlin. But in this timeline, the US doesn't quite trust the Soviets, and so they make a rush for Berlin, and the Soviets also don't trust the Allies, and so they see this rush as like them trying to take the whole of Germany, and so they make a rush themselves for Berlin, with Stalin even instructing his troops to, you can, shoot any Allied soldiers you see on sight. And so with this, it's basically, an act of aggression, an act of war, and so this new war starts, hence Red Inferno, Red being the Soviets. And this honestly massively backfires, as America turns its attention away from Japan as it did in our timeline. It was focused on Japan after World War II, and it instead turns it towards Germany, or, the Soviet-occupied Germany. The Americans decide to bomb the USSR, essentially stopping their, progression into Europe. The Germans that are left over in Germany decide to surrender and join the Allies. So everyone seems to be fighting against the USSR, and this results basically in the Soviets being all but destroyed, and America being the one and only superpower in the world. And I don't even think there would be like an American-Soviet Cold War after this, as they were just that much weaker after losing this, mini war. So yeah, pretty awful decisions from the Soviets in this timeline, but it does make you think of what could have happened. Tier 12, the New Deal coalition retained. So this is an alternate timeline where through a series of events, the civil rights movement in America is largely pushed by Republicans as opposed to Democrats. This, as you can imagine, leads to a huge chain of events to series of things happening, some of which involve the US winning the Vietnam War, the AIDS virus being completely wiped out, which, thank God, but it was through some pretty brutal means. It leads to the Queen of England stepping down as well, and this is all after Prince Philip actually dies, so she gets like super sad, super depressed. She steps down, and Prince Charles is now king. Iran becomes a communist state as opposed to an Islamic one. NATO gets dissolved in 1998. China moves away from communism and forms a coalition with India. Ted Bundy, the, freaking serial killer, he ends up actually being elected to the highest office in America, the literal president, which is just bonkers. And I think if you like really well fleshed out timelines. This has like honestly so much detail in it. There is so much content from like the 60s and the lead up in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It goes from foreign incidents to elections to World War III. And it's kind of fun because it ties in people that are well known in, you know, our timeline. So for example, Ted Bundy, but he's in a different role in this universe. I mean, he's still in the serial killer role, as nobody knows that he's a serial killer, even while he is the president. But there's a bunch of other kind of cameos, I guess you'd call it, you know, people that we know well, but they are just in a slightly different or very different role in this timeline. Ogre Shrugs. So this, for me at least, is a pretty interesting one. We've covered the premise for this timeline in the, you know, higher up in the iceberg, which was player 2 start. And in that timeline, Sony and Nintendo end up kind of following through on their collaboration, and they form, you know, the PlayStation NES hybrid. And of course, in our timeline, Nintendo kind of pulled out of the deal. It was a little more complicated than that, but Nintendo basically pulled away, and Sony ended up making the PlayStation on their own. And yeah, that basically started Sony with, you know, making the PlayStations, making gaming consoles. But this timeline basically asks, what if Norio Ogre, who was the president of Sony at the time, what if when Nintendo pulled away from this deal, as the title suggests, he just shrugged? If he said, you know, whatever. They went back to, you know, focusing on their audio related software, hardware, and they never actually went into the video game console market. Well, that is the story of Ogre Shrugs. And this is, for me, as, you know, a self-proclaimed nerd, a incredibly fun one. There are some changes which are like super subtle, and some which are quite substantial, I think. One thing that has changed is that without the emergence of Sony into this market, video games as a whole remain kind of less popular. They're more fringe, they're more for, you know, nerds and dorks sort of thing, rather than as being something super mainstream for cool kids, for nerds alike. So that's one at least minor medium change. Gran Turismo and Gears of War never existed, or at least don't exist in this timeline. There are a bunch more games which either do or don't exist, or do exist but obviously aren't Sony exclusives, or big Sony characters that were made by, you know, other companies, other studios. Obviously can't be Sony characters because Sony isn't, you know, in this industry, so they end up being characters for either Sega or Nintendo. And so yeah, there's obviously a ton of changes, which, you know, you might expect after you remove like 50% of the entire market, which, I mean, Sony has had a huge impact on this entire industry. And because the PlayStation is never released, the Super Nintendo and Genesis stay more popular for longer. And these ones are the 4th generation of video game consoles. And the first major changes start to really be noticed in the 5th generation. The Sega Dreamcast actually does somewhat decently in this new timeline, because a major part of the Dreamcast doing so badly, and of eventually, you know, Sega dropping out of the market entirely, was the release of the PlayStation 2, which was a lot better, a lot more popular, and so no one was really buying the Dreamcast. I mean, have you ever seen anyone on this console? And so that kind of spelled the end of Sega, at least in this industry. But with Sony gone, Sega is still alive, the Dreamcast is, you know, reasonably popular, so it's a very interesting timeline, as I said, all round. And one thing I did notice while, you know, looking through this history is that while Sony and Microsoft, you know, with the Xbox kind of own the main video game consoles, Nintendo, as opposed to Sega, you know, completely dropping out, Nintendo kind of went the route of niche video game consoles. Like, if you notice, they stopped really competing for the main consoles. Like the NES and the SNES used to be the big consoles of the day, and with Microsoft and Sony kind of coming in and outshining them, they've produced honestly some super consoles like the Switch, like the Wii, and the Nintendo DS. So in our timeline, they have, I think, very cleverly, very skillfully pivoted from, you know, the main consoles to the slightly more niche consoles. But anyway, great timeline. Definitely go check it out. The Gate of Worlds explores a timeline slightly similar to something we covered higher up in the iceberg, which is, what if the Black Death, instead of just killing 1/4 of Europe, what if it instead killed 3/4 of Europe? what would Europe and the rest of the world look like? Well, with 3/4 of Europe now dead, this basically stalls progress in Europe for quite a long time. And with the European progress stalled, this allows the Ottoman Empire to basically fully take over Europe, and for Islam to kind of influence Europe more so than Christianity does. The Ottoman Empire conquers Constantinople in 1420, and then Vienna 20 years later, Paris 20 years after that, and soon they conquer the entire British Isles, and obviously the rest of Europe. And so because Europe is basically hindered, this means the European explorers are also, set back, so they never conquer the Americas, at least not at the time that they did, and so this allows a bunch of the American civilizations and groups to, flourish, grow stronger, and that's kind of the general idea, the general backdrop of this timeline. The particular story follows this 18-year-old from a super poor England, it's almost like third world sort of status, who ends up traveling over to the Aztec Empire in order to, find his meaning, to find wealth, to find his fortune, and that's kind of the story. A pretty cool story, I think, a pretty cool idea, which I have personally thought about myself. I've also thought about it the other way around, of if the Black Death never actually occurred, or if it didn't affect Europe somehow. Because yeah, it was an absolutely bonkers event that completely changed the world and civilization even up to today. And obviously in this timeline, with the Ottoman Empire basically taking over Europe, most of Europe has kind of an Islamic, feeling, an Islamic influence. And I believe they actually talk Turkish, or at least use the Turkish script in this England. So yeah, vastly different to our timeline, and it just makes you think, what could have been? The Cuban Missile War. So this explores the very obvious, I think, alt history of what would have happened if the Cuban Missile Crisis had gone very badly. And for those of you who don't know, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962, and the lead up for it happened just a year earlier, when the US put nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey was obviously like right up close to the Soviet Union, and so the Soviets obviously didn't like this too much. And at roughly the same time, the Americans had trained up these Cuban exiles, and they had planned to basically go into Cuba and to overthrow the Cuban government, or the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. And so all of this basically culminated with the USSR saying, look, if you're gonna put nukes near our territory, then we can do basically the same thing. They went to Cuba and basically said, look, we'll place some nukes in Cuba, basically right next to the US. It would kind of threaten America in a weird way to try and get America to take the nukes away from the Soviet Union, and this will even deter the US from attacking Cuba, so we're kind of helping you out. They saw it as killing two birds with one stone sort of thing, but this damn near killed every bird on the entire planet. So the US eventually found out about these weapons, and to make a long story short, they basically saw this as a threat, quite naturally. They considered airstriking Cuba and going in anyway to try and, neutralize these weapons, but then they decided against that. Instead, it was kind of basically like a extended schlong measuring contest between the US and the USSR, where neither side really wanted to back down. The US ended up sending in, constant aerial surveillance, looking over the area, seeing and detecting these bombs, and then they put up a blockade around Cuba. They wouldn't let anyone through, without their permission and without checking the ships. And the USSR said that they saw this blockade as illegal, and they said that they would instruct their ships to just completely ignore the blockade, and if they were attacked, then they would consider this a declaration of war. This went on back and forth for days and days, and one slip at this point in time could very well have meant, nukes going off basically at the end of the world. And each side did actually slip up a little bit, but there was somehow enough, understanding, enough temperance for the whole thing not to blow up into nuclear war. Like I mentioned earlier, the US sent in a surveillance plane over Cuba, and they agreed beforehand among themselves, among the Americans, they agreed that if this plane was shot down, that would be an act of aggression from the Russians, and it would mean they're basically planning to attack, and so America should attack them first. Like, if it gets shot down, just don't even think about it, just start bombing Cuba, and the Soviets reasoned that if this US plane was shot down, that the Americans would see this as an act of war by the Russians or by the Soviets. And the Soviets had decided to just get a preemptive strike in on America. And so both sides kind of had these pre-planned out ideas, but when the plane was actually shot down, none of this happened. Everyone, chilled out a little bit. And it should also be noted that the leader of the Soviet Union said explicitly not to shoot down these planes. So them shooting down the plane was actually like an unauthorized act, but it was close either way. And there was this moment towards the end of this crisis where the US out at sea started firing these little, relatively small, relatively harmless missiles, or, depth charges, down at this Soviet submarine. Now, it being all the way down here, it had no way of contacting the surface, and so the Russians basically wanted to call it up to the surface to talk with it, and so they were trying to get its attention by firing these little annoying charges down at it. But the United States didn't actually know that this sub was nuclear armed, and the people in the sub themselves were instructed that if any, firing took place, if someone was firing down at them, then that probably meant that the war had started, and so they were instructed, or they were allowed to, use their nuclear weapon and fire it at American ships or at the American homeland. And so the captain of this submarine actually decided to fire this nuke. But the firing of the nuke actually required the consent of the 3 top officers on the submarine. And while the captain did say, fire the nuke, and while one of the officers did also say to fire the nuke, the last top officer, Vasily Arkhipov, said, "No, I don't consent to firing this weapon." And so they couldn't fire it, and they, came to the surface, they spoke with the US ships, and they ended up basically just sailing away back to Russia. But it was literally down to this one guy. Like, the other 2 said yes already. It was down to him. He said no. He stopped the firing of this nuke, and if this weapon had been fired, it very well could have resulted in a nuclear war. So Vasily's act of constraint here may very well have saved the entire world. The Soviets ended up removing their nukes from Cuba. The US stopped their blockade of Cuba and also removed the nukes from Italy and Turkey. And the US also agreed, okay, we won't invade Cuba or start a coup or anything like that. And this was apparently good enough for both sides. Oh, and through all of this, Castro was absolutely insane. He was calling the Soviets weak. He was saying like, yeah, we should have just fired on America to teach them a lesson. And Castro said, yeah, if they step foot in Cuba, we're just gonna fire all of the nukes at America. And he also fully admitted that this would likely have resulted in the death of every single Cuban, or at least every person in Cuba. But he didn't care. He said we should have done it anyway, but thankfully, once again, the Soviets were a little more tempered. So yeah, he was nuts. Anyway, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now onto the actual alt timeline. Like, I know we're in a history class or something, but yeah, in this alternate timeline, Vasily, who was the one guy who said no to firing the nuke, he was actually incapacitated, and so he wasn't able to say no or yes, and so the decision went to the other 2 people, and they, as we all know, both said yes to firing the nuke. The nuke was fired, and then, as you can imagine, things kicked off. This leads to, among other things, the Soviets invading West Germany, as they already occupied East Germany after World War II. There are tons of nukes going off all over the world. A bunch of the US cities that are nuked have like perimeters set up around them, with the president instructing soldiers to not let anyone in or out of these cities. Like, if they're already outside of the city, it's too dangerous to go in. And for anyone inside the city, he said he doesn't want them spreading radiation all around the country, so he keeps them, boarded in. This kind of turns America into like a political dictatorship, with President Johnson saying, look, I need to use emergency powers in this time of, well, emergency, and the people eventually just get sick of him abusing his powers and overthrow him just a few years later. So it is a bit of a wild timeline. It was an insane event or crisis, even in our timeline where everything seemed to go somewhat okay, but thankfully, thanks to Vasily, this timeline is just a alternate timeline. The Difference Engine is an alt history where this guy, Charles Babbage, which is an awesome name by the way, but this is a world in which he essentially successfully builds his inventions, and these were the analytical machine and the difference machine. So in our timeline, in the original timeline, he is this super smart guy, and he imagines and designs these machines, which are basically just like calculating machines essentially, but they don't actually get built until much later in the 1900s. But what if he had actually managed to build them out a whole 100 years roughly than they actually originally got built in? What would that have meant for technology back then, and by, extension, technology today? Well, unsurprisingly enough, this would have led to earlier technological advancements. And actually, this alternate timeline, this book, was thought to have been responsible for the massive emergence of the, steampunk aesthetic, where you have more advanced technology for the time in like an 1800s style kind of vibe, obviously where steam technology is popular. But anyway, because of this invention and building this machine, the British Empire ends up being a lot stronger, a lot more powerful, a lot more technologically advanced, and so they basically end up dominating the whole of Europe. Not like taking them over dominating, but just being a lot more powerful. The Irish potato famine never takes place, which thank God. And so Britain is super powerful and prosperous. Ireland doesn't starve, nor are they, basically enslaved. And so Ireland doesn't really see Britain as that bad, and they don't really want to seek independence. They generally love Britain and are proud to be a part of it. So that's the general, overview of the timeline, which in my opinion is pretty cool. And the plot takes us through some characters, some political schemes, basically revolving around these machines, which can be programmed kind of with like punch cards, and there's a search on for some like mysterious, super powerful punch cards. So just imagine it in the modern era with computers as like powerful computer programs that can do a bunch of cool stuff. These are these punch cards. So yeah, I super love the vibe of this one. The story is pretty cool. It has that steampunk aesthetic. It's, as I said, one of at least the origins of steampunk, and yeah, definitely something you should check out if you like this sort of thing, if you like historical alt histories or steampunky ones or 1800s era ones. But yeah, very cool one. Definitely check it out. 1942. Now, as you can imagine from the naming of this timeline, I will let you guess who the author of this is. And I'm getting pretty tired of saying this, but it is an alt history written by Robert Conroy. It's a pretty simple one. It basically just imagines the Pearl Harbor attacks by the Japanese as going more successful for the Japanese than they did in our timeline. So the Japanese end up taking over Hawaii, and this story basically takes us through the US trying to fight and take it back. So yeah, fairly simple one, but a fun timeline. Crimson Skies was actually a board game that explored the world of what if the Great Depression was actually the Greater Depression. What if the Great Depression was so bad that it basically fractured the United States and broke it up into these multiple different states, like the Empire State or the Communist People's Collective of the Great Plains state. And the idea is, with how fractured the US now is, that ground delivery and to some extent travel kind of falls out of, popularity in place of air travel and delivery. And so you play a pilot flying around the skies of America, the crimson skies, if you will. And you can either save people, you can steal shipments, you can attack other ships or planes, and apparently it is one hell of a board game. I am yet to pick it up, but the board game has fantastic reviews for it. The video game that was made afterwards has, not so great reviews, so maybe don't waste your time on that one, but the board game is apparently quite fun. So yeah, I like this one. It was kind of a unique timeline. I haven't really covered anything like this before, and it paints kind of an interesting, not super dramatic world, and it also has a super fun board game. So win-win-win. The Place Promised in Our Early Days is an anime with some pretty cool art. I mean, just look at that. I mean, it's probably not super impressive of art, but I'm always just blown away by the style of animes. But yeah, this takes place in an alternate timeline where the Soviets actually occupy the Japanese island of Hokkaido, which likely happened in this timeline, I think, after Japan split into, you know, the Soviet North and the non-Soviet South after World War II. Funnily enough, this came somewhat close to happening in our actual timeline, but obviously didn't happen. And it seems like to me now that a lot of these proxy wars just end in these countries being split in two, with, you know, the Soviets controlling one side and the non-Soviets controlling the other. You have like Vietnam, Korea, Japan in this timeline, China in the other timeline. And yeah, anyway, so we have a Soviet Hokkaido, and I won't get too into the plot as it isn't super important, I don't think. But yeah, the Soviet Union begins development of this strange tower in Hokkaido. And there are these 3 kids from Aomori who are Haruki, Takuya, and Suyuri. And they all dream about one day going over to Hokkaido and, you know, visiting this tower. Now, they find this small aircraft basically crashed nearby, and they decide to, you know, fix her up and then eventually fly over to this other island. But this naturally takes a while, and during this time in the summer, Suyuri just mysteriously goes missing. So time passes, these 2 boys, the other 2, you know, kids, they're not really working on this plane anymore. Their friend went missing, you know, a while back, but they all eventually find out that Suyuri has been living in a alternate reality in which she is all alone, and they also find out that this tower on Hokkaido basically replaces matter in our reality with matter in other realities. So yeah, very strange. It ends with them eventually finishing the plane, actually flying over to this tower and destroying it, saving the world. So, you know, all is good. And yeah, it's a pretty cool timeline. Again, it's more like an alternate reality sort of thing, and I do sometimes question if these actually count as alternate timelines, as, you know, you could say any work of fiction really, like the Pokemon universe, is like an alternate timeline, I suppose. But I think it does mix things up a little bit. These are often, you know, a little light-hearted, it's anime, it's a bit different, so I think I would get bored doing, you know, constant war historical sort of timelines. So yeah, as I said, this does help mix it up a little bit, but it's not a super strict or realistic or likely alt history. But yeah, take from that what you will. Still seems like a pretty cool anime. McGoverning is a alternate timeline that focuses on someone that we've covered before, George McGovern. And he was a politician who in our timeline was kind of famous or like infamous for losing one of the worst elections of all time. He ran for the US president in 1972 against Richard Nixon, and he lost every single state in America except 1 state. And this alternate timeline basically has things going a little bit differently, and it actually has some of Richard Nixon's team going a bit, you know, loopy and actually like firebombing their political opponents. And this leads to some more, you know, dramatic things from the Nixon administration. A bunch of Nixon's corruption gets, you know, revealed a lot sooner than in our timeline. And due to all of this, nobody really wants to vote for Nixon, and so McGovern actually ends up winning the 1972 election. So how does that change things? Well, honestly, it's a little hard to summarize this one. A bunch of stuff happens really differently, which I know that's not too useful or too helpful, but there are just a ton of, I think, in my opinion, quite small, insignificant changes in this timeline compared to our one, that it doesn't really make sense for me to, you know, list out all the tiny changes that happened. But the Archbishop, for example, is nearly assassinated, not even fully assassinated, just nearly. The leader of Chile is killed in an assassination as opposed to a coup like in our timeline. Something called the Mills Affair goes slightly differently in our timeline, which for those of you who haven't heard about the Mills Affair, absolutely check it out. It is a wild story. And yeah, as I said, Nixon goes a bit loopy. He starts beating his wife. He starts drinking heavily. His administration also goes a bit wild. Nixon starts threatening to drop nukes on Vietnam. It's all just absolutely nutso. So yeah, one hell of a wild timeline if you want to check it out, but There you go. Castro's bomb is a... God damn, it's by Robert Conroy again. But Castro's bomb explores the question of what would the world look like if, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we covered earlier, what if a year after that there was actually some weapons still left in Cuba, and what if Castro used them against the United States? And I mean, in this timeline, the part of, or the United States that Castro is attacking is technically kind of part of Cuba. So Guantanamo Bay, which you might have heard about, is actually a US military base or prison system that is actually in Cuba. And it's funny, the reason why the US has Guantanamo Bay was that Cuba leased out this whole area to them roughly 100 years ago, and they had them on an unlimited lease. So it never expired, it never runs out, and they only have to pay a few $1,000s every single year. So America kind of got the golden deal here, and I guess Castro was, pissed that he couldn't kick the Americans out legally, so he just decided to bomb it. Which, as we learned before with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is like so Castro. He was a bit nutso. So yeah, Castro bombs Guantanamo Bay, and then he points more weapons at the United States, saying like, you best back off or else, which is like, really, Castro? You really think you're winning that war? You crazy man. But this whole alternate timeline is basically JFK trying to neutralize this whole crisis, just like he did in the original Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I said, it is by our favorite man, Robert Conroy, which it does have some mixed reviews. A bunch of people say this is an absolute fantastic page turner, while others do say it's not quite as good as his other ones, perhaps. So I will leave that up to you to decide. Tier 13, 11, 22, 63. So this is a timeline written by Robert Conroy. I'm only kidding. It's actually written by Stephen King, and it explores a world where a man goes back, he discovers time travel, and he goes back to 11, 22, 63. And the aim is to prevent a major event that happened on that day, and that was the assassination of JFK. So it's a pretty cool timeline, I think, and obviously spoilers up ahead in case you are thinking of reading it. But the main character in the story is called Jake, and he gets called over to a diner by one of his friends one evening. And when he gets there, he learns from his friend that he has discovered a time slip, a time portal, a time gateway that is in the back of the diner, and once you go through it, it always takes you back to the exact same date, and that is September 9th, 1958. And his friend says to Jake, look, I went back into this portal, I traveled back, I spent a few years there, I was trying to prevent the JFK assassination attempt, but sadly I'm ill now, I can't go on, I don't have much longer to live, and so you have to, complete this mission for me. Which, that's a hell of a request, but Jake obliges. He goes back to 1958, and to test this whole time travel thing, he goes back and saves his friend's family, who in the real timeline, the father basically killed the whole family. So he goes back to around that time, saves the family, and then travels back to the future to see how it affected things. And it does kind of work. His actions had some effect on the future, but when he goes to visit his friend, he finds out that his friend is no longer alive. By saving his family in the past, it led to a chain of events which actually had his friend die in Vietnam. So it's like, great, he went back to save his friend some heartache, and he actually ended up causing his death. And he goes back in time again, he saves some people, with his hindsight. And obviously, while he's back in 1958, he needs to live, he needs to eat, and so he gets a job as a teacher, and he basically meets the love of his life. And so, since he went back to 1958, the assassination happens in 1963, so he's basically got 5 years to kill, and he just spends it back then with the love of his life as a teacher until eventually he comes to 1963. He stops the assassination on JFK, but in the process of this, the love of his life, who he's been with for 5 years, ends up getting killed. Then there is a mysterious man with a yellow card in his hat. They call him Yellow Card Man, which, I mean, That's creative. And he is basically a TVA officer. He tells Jake that messing with these timelines, with these dimensions, is never a good thing, and it will eventually result in the end of the universe. Jake doesn't really believe him, so he takes Jake back to 2011, and the 2011 world is just in utter chaos. Bombs going off everywhere, nuclear fallout is like the norm. A bunch of tragedies that actually happened in our timeline still happen in this timeline, only much, much worse. And a bunch of tragedies that were averted in our timeline also happen in this timeline. So it's like the worst of all worlds. The Civil Rights Act were never passed. The entire world is basically on the verge of collapse. And so the yellow card man basically says, look, if you promise not to do any more time traveling, I will put you back into your own timeline. I'll, right everything that was wronged. And so Jake more or less agrees to this. I mean, I don't really think he has a choice, but yeah, that's what happens. And so since Jake originally went back to 1958 and fell in love with, the love of his life, Sadie, when he gets sent back to 2011, he's still relatively young because, time travel. But Sadie, the original Sadie, is now 80 years old. And also, she doesn't know who Jake is because she's never lived the timeline where Jake was there. And so, as it happens, Sadie is being celebrated as the citizen of the century, for her work in politics and charity. And so, when Jake eventually tracks Sadie down, there's this big celebration going on. Jake asks Sadie, this lovely 80-year-old lady, to a dance, and she says, oh, sweet young man, of course I'll dance with you, even though she has no idea who he is. And she actually asks Jake who he is, and he just says, someone you knew in another life, honey, which is just romantic as heck. And that is the timeline. So a pretty interesting one, I think, a pretty fun one, but you'd expect really nothing less from Stephen King. Twilight of the Red Tsar. So in our timeline, in our universe, Stalin, as you might know, this asshole, died alone in his bedroom in 1953 from a stroke. But in Twilight of the Red Tsar, Stalin basically survives this stroke. And this whole timeline is basically asking, what if Stalin didn't die in 1953? Well, Stalin was generally super paranoid. He was paranoid about the people surrounding him, the closest people to him, either shooting him or killing him in his sleep or poisoning him. And so he made it a habit to just randomly kill people. Even his closest advisors, his closest friends, he would think these people are the most likely people to kill me because they're so trusted by me, they're so close to me. And so he would, throw a curveball every now and then and just kill one of his best friends, his closest friends. And yeah, he was just absolutely off his nut. And so in this timeline, he is still paranoid as ever. He is still killing people close to him. He is still killing entire families, deleting all evidence that they ever existed. Birth certificates, passports, eradicating them from photos, which is something they actually did in this timeline, which is insane. And because Stalin ended up living, the communist Great Leap Forward in China, which in our timeline killed between 30 and 50 million people, in this timeline ends up being much worse, if you can even imagine that. And honestly, if you haven't already, look up the Great Leap Forward, because I think everyone knows and talks about, the Germans in World War II, but not so much gets talked about Stalin and about the Great Leap Forward. So yeah, some absolutely horrific stuff. Definitely check it out. But anyway, this comes about basically because Stalin kind of clashes with Mao, and this leads to basically attacks happening on China, nuclear bombs, chemical warfare, which leads to even more deaths in China and actually leads to a Chinese civil war. There's also a civil war that happens in Russia. There are nukes kind of flying back and forth. It's all very crazy. The US actually ends up dropping nukes on China as well, partly to kill Mao, partly to end the Korean War. And yeah, because Russia ends up being a lot worse and a lot more brutal than in our timeline, Stalin just starts killing everyone. He attacks Jews, he starts killing Chinese, and even just Asians in general. And because of this, because of Stalin's actions, this basically wipes out communism, because every country is like, yeah, I do not want to be caught dead looking like that dude Stalin. So communism completely falls out of favor. Nobody is communist. Everyone hates communism. them. And everyone also really hates the Russians. There is a lot less anti-Semitism worldwide just because of the, attacks on them. And the world also has a more favorable view of Asians in general, again because of the brutal attacks that they had faced. So yeah, probably a fairly realistic timeline, I would say. As I said, Stalin was an absolute nutcase, and I hate to imagine what the world would look like if he had lived, even a few extra weeks, a few extra months, years, decades. It could have just gone extremely, extremely badly. But that is Twilight of the Red Tsar. Green Antarctica is honestly a bit of a dark timeline. It imagines a world which is more or less identical to our world, except Antarctica is green. It's not frozen over, it has some life on it, and the idea is that long, long ago, people and animals came over from Australia, and they came down onto Antarctica. And for whatever reason, in this universe, in this timeline, Antarctica isn't frozen over, so it is somewhat livable, but it is still very cold and very, hostile and very windy. And in this timeline, the people on Antarctica are basically unaware of everyone else on Earth, and also everyone else on Earth is unaware of the people on Antarctica. And this was way back in the day before Antarctica was actually explored, so it does make sense how they would be unaware of one another. And so in this timeline, James Cook, cool guy, heads out there on his ship exploring, and in our timeline he wasn't actually able to make it to the land, but in this alternate timeline he does make it to shore, and he meets the inhabitants of Antarctica, the Tsalal. Now it's kind of hard to describe in words how messed up Antarctica is and how messed up these people were, and even the animals that live on there. The general idea is that this landscape, this continent, is so brutal, it is so harsh and freezing cold all the time and windy, that all living creatures on this continent end up equally brutal and, insane and crazy. The animals are all like, Jesus Christ, there's this giant kangaroo with these huge deadly claws. There's an animal which is described as like a cross between a wolverine and a piranha. Antarctic koalas are, well, they're kind of carnivorous, which would be bad enough if they didn't also lay their eggs inside of other animals, animals including humans, both when they're dead and alive. So there is a huge range of psychotic, vicious, attacking animals, which are basically like the norm in Antarctica, which is also to say nothing about the human inhabitants of Antarctica. They, by default just enjoy torture, enjoy murder, and one account says it's perfectly normal in this culture for, say, a son to kill his father and then take his mother and sister as wives. This is the kind of stuff we're dealing with here. So yeah, when Captain Cook lands ashore, he meets these people, he is quite quickly tortured, enslaved, and it is said that he basically fears for the rest of the people in the world. Once, they figure out how to travel, to make boats, what the world will look like if these people are spread across the world. And I won't spoil the ending of it, but basically these people eventually do break out of Antarctica, and some pretty mad stuff ensues. So yeah, definitely some terrifying creatures and descriptions of this timeline, and it is probably one of the darker ones that I've ever read. A golden island to the west. So this is in reference, of course, to California. Now, California is not technically, or it's not even at all, an island, but as I've mentioned before in my ocean iceberg, it was once thought to actually have been an island. Oh, sorry, that's confusing. It was never an island, but we once did think it was an island. I think it was partly because of this peninsula here, where we assumed this was the bottom part of the island, and so we just assumed the entire thing was disconnected. And this was even drawn up on some old school maps, so yeah, it's a pretty interesting piece of history. But this timeline is basically a time travel timeline where the entire state of California from the 2018 era gets sent all the way back in place to 1850, which is just when officially California got its, membership to the United States. And as you can imagine, modern California is completely shocked by the, United States of the 1800s, and the rest of the world and, the United States is completely shocked by this modern California that just pops up out of nowhere and has this highly advanced technology, medicine, computers, weaponry, and California really doesn't like slavery naturally, and they're so appalled at slavery in the United States that they repeatedly vote to secede from the United States, even potentially further down the line actually becoming their own country. A bunch of the things that happen, in the future in our timeline, a bunch of that is revealed to people in the past in this timeline. So like the Tsar of Russia is told about the Great Revolution, the rulers of Korea are basically told about, an upcoming coup, power struggle sort of thing. And so each leader in this case is like working to, fix or prevent those problems coming up. So the Tsar is like, how can I treat these people a little more fairly maybe, so that they don't uprise against me? And how can I completely, root out communism, the early days of communism, and stop it completely before it even starts? And Korea also does fairly similar things, even going so far as to, trace back the ancestors of who was responsible for this coup, and to either watch them, imprison them, kill them long before they've even done anything to begin with. And some of these attempts are more successful than others, but they are all attempted nonetheless. It's a pretty cool timeline, I think, but I think I'm biased with all things time travel. But yeah, fairly cool idea and a nice read. The North American Confederacy Series. So this is a timeline written by L. Neil Smith, and this entire timeline is created and changed and different by, I kid you not, one single word being changed in the Declaration of Independence, and where it says that the government derives its just power from the consent of the governed. This timeline simply adds an extra word in there, being unanimous. So the government derives its just power from the unanimous consent of the governed. Now, for this timeline, we have to briefly touch on something called the Whiskey Rebellion, which was in 1791 a tax levied by the government on whiskey made by US farmers, more or less. Basically, after the Revolutionary War versus, Britain, in order to pay for this war, the US had to take out a bunch of loans. And now that they were an actual nation, they had to start paying these loans back. They had to develop taxes and some way of, generating money. And so Washington, George, thought that we should tax some luxury things, perhaps. He didn't want to tax like shelter, property, food, because he thought the country was struggling enough as it is, and so he put a tax on what he saw as a luxury product, that being whiskey. And he thought, nobody would get too upset at taxing whiskey, but they did. And this tax was strange because he was taxing whiskey, but most of the whiskey was actually made by just regular farmers who had like leftover crops, surplus, stuff like that, and they put it in to be fermented and then turned into whiskey. And a lot of these farmers had worked incredibly hard during the, Revolutionary War. A bunch of them had even fought in the war. And so after they put in all their hard work, after they, won the war, they came back home, they said, yes, we're gonna, live as a free country, and then they were just being massively taxed for one of their most profitable products. So as you can imagine, the farmers were pissed. Washington sent, people over there to try and collect these taxes, and a gang of farmers basically came together. They started rioting, protesting, they refused to pay these taxes, and there was like this small back and forth where the sheriff would get sent down there to, quell the riots, to collect taxes, and then the farmers would gather with a group of 50 violent people, and then the sheriff would have to back down, and then they sent in like a small militia, and then even more farmers came in and they wouldn't back down, and then eventually Washington himself rode down there with, a well-armed militia of like 13,000 armed people. And these 13,000 were provided by the local, states. Each state had its well-armed, well-maintained militia. They donated them all to come in to quell the farmers, to help collect these taxes. And when they finally got down there, all the farmers had just kind of gone home. Like, I guess nobody really wanted to fight when he came down here with a small army, essentially. And eventually the farmers were brought around partly by, a show of force, partly by words and arguments, and things after that went a little more smoothly. But in this timeline, a man named Albert Gallatin, who was actually a man on the side of the government. In our timeline, he helped convince the farmers that, this is good for the country, it's a fair tax, and helped bring them round to the government side. And so, as I said, in this alternate timeline, that little pesky word of unanimous, that actually put Gallatin over to the side of the farmers. So, you know, unanimous meaning everyone votes for something, like a unanimous decision from a jury, for example. And I don't know exactly how they do this, because you wouldn't get a unanimous vote on anything, I don't think. But maybe it meant like a more representative vote. But anyway, in this timeline, because of that word, Gallatin said this wasn't a unanimous tax, or a unanimously agreed upon tax, and so he ended up siding with the farmers. And this basically ends up leading to a second civil war, one in which Washington, George Washington, is actually overthrown and killed for treason. And so after this, the Constitution is removed. Gallatin is basically president of this new United States, and a new constitution is written up with more of an emphasis on individual rights. And a fun fact is that early America, when it was, you know, being founded, didn't really have any documentation for individual rights. Like, you know, nowadays you have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, which says or gives people or recognizes people's certain individual rights. Originally, you just had the rights of the federal government or the limits of the federal government. You had the rights of the states. It was all that sort of thing. And then they realized, hey, we're not actually talking that much about the individual. So then they later on introduced individual recognized rights. But yeah, this new constitution in this timeline had more individual rights, more individual freedoms, and with less of the power centered around the government, and yeah, more on the individual people. So for example, in this timeline, the federal government couldn't print money. Money could only be made by individual people, and it had to be backed by tangible things like gold, like iron, or even stuff like grains, crops, and whiskey. Thomas Jefferson ends slavery a whole lot sooner than happened in our timeline, and he does it peacefully without a civil war. They also create a new calendar system, with 1776 being, you know, the start year, which is like the year of liberation. So 1776 would be the year 0. So I guess we're in the year 248 now, which is, yeah, a little bit strange. So this obviously leads to a more libertarian society, and it leads to a ton more advancements in scientific thinking, in mathematics, in technological advancements. As I said, slavery was ended in 1820. The telephone was invented a lot sooner, and they actually developed technology to allow apes to communicate with humans, and this eventually led to humans recognizing apes as intelligent beings and actually giving them citizen rights, which is a bit crazy. And then also these, you know, discoveries were extended to like dolphins and orcas and whales. Like, can you imagine a dolphin on a podium like running for president or something? There were some pretty early Native American presidents. There were a bunch of female presidents. Things were a lot more egalitarian, a lot more fair, a lot more balanced. And one of the female presidents had actually gone to the moon, which that's a bit nuts. Can you imagine like George Bush, like bopping around on the moon or something? Frederick Douglass actually becomes president, which is awesome because he is a super cool guy if you look him up. And yeah, so that's basically the entire timeline. The idea is that libertarianism is a good thing, and that the more freedoms we have as a society, as an individual, the more we are able to think about things and to discover things and to experiment. And this would have led to a better society than the one we have now. So yeah, a pretty cool timeline, and personal liberties are always a plus. Denda Est is another time-traveling timeline that was written all the way back in 1955, so quite an old one. But it is a super fun timeline that explores traveling back in time to 200 BC and killing some people who didn't originally die in our timeline. And this results basically in Hannibal destroying Rome shortly after. Now, at this time, the two major powers in like Europe in the Mediterranean were the Romans and the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians were this insane nation, you know, this city of Carthage, that I could honestly go on for days about. It was a crazy nation. They were at many points the richest city in the whole of the Mediterranean, and basically in the whole of Europe. And if you want to learn about some super cool ancient civilizations, ancient cultures, definitely check out Carthage. And maybe I'll do an iceberg about them sometime in the future. But basically, long ago, back before even Judaism was founded, before it was a religion, you had basically the Canaanites, you had Phoenicians, and they were all roughly in sort of this area and a little bit more towards the east. And it was some of these people who eventually did, become Hebrews, became Samaritans, but some of these original people obviously didn't become any of those, and some even traveled down to, Egypt and then further along the coast, and they formed the city of Carthage. Now, as I said, this city was absolutely bonkers. It was similar in ways, or at least it reminded me of Braavos from Game of Thrones, in that it was a port city, it was very wealthy, and it was focused really on stuff like trade routes, merchants, as opposed to, say, the Romans, who were interested in, expanding their land, conquering new areas and new kingdoms. Whereas Carthage, they did have, some areas that they had, conquered, but they basically said, oh, do what you want, we're just going to control all of the trade routes, all of the shipping routes, and we're going to do all of the business basically in the Mediterranean, in Europe, through Carthage. If you wanted to start a business, you'd go to Carthage. If you wanted to sell stuff, you'd go to Carthage. If you wanted to buy like anything, Carthage was the place. And so yeah, they just built out a really strong navy and controlled shipping routes, controlled trade routes, and were extremely wealthy. The build of Carthage was also quite impressive. It looks quite cool, or at least what we imagined, what we think it actually looked like. It had this huge port, in the entrance of it, which led onto a kind of secret, more closed off military port where they built ships, where they housed giant ships. They had quite an advanced political system, at least for that time. It was all honestly really cool. But towards the later days of Carthage, they did start to clash more and more with Rome, as they were both pretty decent political powers. They were both pretty decent military powers. And so from these disputes and conflicts, that leads us into the Punic Wars. Now, the first Punic War started basically because Rome invaded Sicily, which was occupied by Carthage at the time. And yeah, this started the first Punic War, and a lot of these fights were fought over all of these islands in the Mediterranean, the ones basically between Carthage and Italy. And this first war went on for like 23 years, and by the end of it, Carthage had lost all of these islands to Rome, and Hannibal, this great general, wasn't too happy about that. So roughly 20 years after this, after expanding quite far into modern day Spain, Hannibal and Carthage decided essentially to march a bunch of troops, and even quite famously war elephants, further into Spain and then cross over the Alps and to invade Rome from the north. And this was honestly quite unexpected because, as I said, Carthage had a fantastic navy. Their military was also, half decent, but not like amazing. And so Rome always expected that if they were going to attack Rome and Italy, that they would do so navally. They would send ships over, they would maybe surround Rome and Italy and invade from the south, as opposed to this nutso idea of going literally all the way around over these mountains with elephants, no less. And yeah, so they were a little bit taken aback by this, but thanks to Hannibal's insane strength on the battlefield, he just won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Romans back, or the northern Italians, and this went on for roughly like 14 years. Hannibal was doing an amazing job, and eventually Rome just invaded Carthage like directly. They had a strategy to stall Hannibal out, not really allow him to engage in any large battles, just, poke him from little different areas, try and starve him out of food and of supplies, and then go directly after Carthage and try and negotiate some sort of surrender. And that's basically exactly what they did. Carthage called Hannibal back and said, look, can you come back? We're in a bit of a pickle here. And Hannibal, who was running out of supplies, Carthage wasn't really sending him any backup troops, any backup supplies. He kind of had to say, okay, fine. He came all the way down, went back over to Carthage, and they negotiated a surrender. Carthage was to reduce the size of its navy and its military. It was to cede all of its foreign territory to Rome, and it couldn't declare war at all without Rome's express consent. And it also had to pay a large sum, a large, war fee to Rome. So this understandably massively crippled Carthage as like a military threat, and Hannibal, after proving to be one of the greatest military leaders of all time, he came back to Carthage after the war and just got into politics, and he eventually proved to be one of the greatest political thinkers of all time. It was actually pretty insane. He went through like all of the finances, the numbers in Carthage. He rooted out a bunch of corruption. He made Carthage a ton of money by finding out where people were, pocketing money, where they were wasting money. He lowered the crime rates in Carthage. He set up term limits for some of the politicians in Carthage. Like, it was insane. He went from, an insane military leader to like, oh yeah, I'll just try my hand at politics, goes back there, fixes basically the entire city, makes tons of money for them, fully pays off the debt to Rome, and they are slowly building up their economy, getting richer and richer and richer, all after basically being almost wiped out, at least militarily, by Rome. So Hannibal quite rightly thought that the Romans would see him as a threat. The Romans, I think, thought that what they did would severely cripple Carthage for many, many years, but under Hannibal's leadership and influence, that wasn't really the case. So he left Carthage, he went to a basically self-imposed exile, and at the time, there was another independent nation right next to Carthage that was constantly kind of like annoying Carthage, attacking their ships, destroying their people, and Carthage obviously wasn't allowed to attack them back, and they said to Rome, look, do we have permission to defend ourselves? Rome said no. And then they said, okay, if we're not going to defend ourselves, at least can you come in and, help us out? Rome again said no. And so eventually Carthage just said, F it, if you're not going to help us, we'll do it ourselves. They went over, they attacked Numidia, and they actually lost this battle, this war. And this was also used as a reason by Rome to basically try and put an end to Carthage. They said, look, well, you broke the treaty, you broke the agreement of no wars, no attacks, which, as you can tell, was kind of egged on. They were kind of pushed into it by Rome by not helping them defend themselves. But this kind of helped strengthen and push this growing sentiment in Rome, and this sentiment had the slogan of Carthago Denda Est, which is where the title of this timeline comes from, and it is Latin for Carthage must be destroyed. And interestingly enough, Cato, who was a Roman senator, was said to end all of his speeches with Carthago Denda Est, regardless of what the speech was about, what the topic was about. Like, they could be talking about, teddy bears or what they want for dinner or whatever, and then he's like, oh yeah, by the way, Carthage must be destroyed. Like, that's how much he hated Carthage. And so after this battle, Rome declared officially the last war on Carthage, and they went in there. It took them actually 3 years to destroy Carthage. Like, even with its reduced military strength and all that, Carthage put up one hell of a defense, but Rome eventually did break through and they completely destroyed Carthage. Like, they killed, slaughtered basically everyone in there, and the people that were eventually left, they decided not to kill them, roughly 50,000 of them, but they decided just to capture them and to sell them into slavery. I guess they just thought, why kill them when we can just make a bit of money from them? So yeah, and they just sacked the city, burned stuff, destroyed buildings, and naturally Rome claimed the destroyed Carthage. They claimed all of the African territories of Carthage, as well as obviously the islands and the Mediterranean territories. And it wasn't until 100 years later, under Julius Caesar, that Rome went back there and rebuilt Carthage as this beautiful, fantastic city, which they named, well, still Carthage, but they named it Roman Carthage. And yeah, so holy cow, a very long history lesson. Apologies, but this stuff is just wildly fascinating to me. But in Denda Est, this alternate timeline, there are two prominent political figures who were fighting for Rome, essentially. And these were Publio Cornelius Scipio and Scipio Africanus. And so in this alt timeline, both of these people died due to these time travelers. And so Rome really isn't able to put up much of a defense, and so Rome falls to Hannibal. So Carthage ends up dominating Rome in like a, Uno reverse flip sort of way, much the way that Rome did to Carthage in our timeline. And so it spreads its influence, its culture all over Europe instead of Rome spreading it. And so in the modern day, we have a Carthage Celtic sort of style civilization rather than what we have now, which is closer to a Greek or Roman style. This is the eventual world map, roughly, of the different empires and nations. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. don't exist, as the early Canaanites who became Carthage were actually polytheistic, in that their religion had multiple gods like the early Jewish people, or similar to the Romans or Hindus. Some stuff like engineering seems to be more advanced. The scientific method and science as a whole is roughly quite far behind our timeline. And there are also, in discussions about this timeline, questions and debates about whether Carthage would actually have the influence over Europe that Rome had. Because as we discussed, Carthage was more interested in making money, making good trade deals, not necessarily in invading other areas and spreading their culture, like, obviously Rome was. And so it is suggested that if Carthage did win this war, that instead the Celtic influence would have spread rather than the Carthaginian influence. So maybe everyone in Europe would be speaking, Celtic now, who really knows? And that is Denda Est. And honestly, the alternate timeline is a quite minor part of this, I think. The real, absolutely amazing, fascinating thing is the history of Hannibal and Carthage. And yeah, so as I said, if you like history, if you like this sort of thing, absolutely go on a deep dive about Carthage. Until every drop is paid. So this is an old history that has someone murder Lyman Trumbull, who Abraham Lincoln actually lost his Senate race to in 1954. Sorry, actually 1854. 1954 would be a case of time-traveling Lincoln, which sounds like a really cool timeline. But basically, his opponent was killed. Honest Abe becomes a senator a few years earlier than in our timeline. And because of this, he becomes a little more political, a little more aggressive and snappy for some reason. And this, all in all, leads to the American Civil War. It leads to Lincoln becoming the elected president, but with the difference of the Civil War being a lot more brutal than it was in our timeline, because I guess, the North is headed by this more aggressive Lincoln. So he's less forgiving, less understanding. He says we need to completely eradicate the South. And yeah, that leads to more aggression, more death, more suffering. And yeah, AB Boy goes a little bit nuts. So yeah, not too deep of a timeline, but it is an interesting one, I guess, if you like stuff like the Civil War era. World War, War of Equals. So this was a fanfic, basically, written in the world of World War, which is an alt timeline series written by Harry Turtledove, in which aliens invade Earth during World War II. And so this is a fan-made alternate timeline to that alternate timeline, in which aliens do invade Earth, but it asks the question of what if instead of invading during World War II, what if they instead invaded in the 21st century? Well, obviously we'd put up a lot better of a fight against them. We'd have stronger weapons, we'd have stronger militaries, we'd have, radars and all this advanced technology. And so the basic premise for this is that aliens send this probe outwards and they see mankind, they see Earth in like the Middle Ages sort of time. So they think, all right, this species is super weak. They just have spears and rudimentary guns sort of thing. Rudimentary guns being, of course, bows and arrows. And so they think they'll make for an easy invasion. But by the time they get here, of course, it takes time for light to travel, so they're actually seeing Earth in the past, and it takes them time to travel to Earth. So after all that is said and done, we are actually in the 21st century. So what they thought would be a piece of cake actually ends up being an entire cake, and that entire cake is now ready to kill them. And this timeline is similar in ways to the original alternate timeline, which we did actually cover. But one of the main differences, obviously, is that the aliens don't beat us quite so easily. A bunch of the countries around the world form like coalitions to defend themselves, to defend their neighbors. So it's some ways similar to the original alternate timeline, which is, I think, pretty cool in and of itself. But this one just has more of a modern spin, a modern flavor to it, which is also pretty cool. The Boys, the comic books to be precise. Or if I want to be really precise, I guess it's the comics. So for those of you who haven't seen The Boys, absolutely check it out. It is a fantastic TV series, but this entry is about the comic books in particular, not necessarily the TV spin-off or the TV adaptation. And while the two are similar in a bunch of different ways, after doing some research, I basically realized that yes, they are quite different in very many ways. And the basic premise for the comic book series and for the TV series is that superheroes exist, they are out and about in the world, and it is all basically caused by this compound called called V. And some of them inject it, some of them have it flowing through their veins, as children. And that's basically the main premise. Now, in the comics, things are a lot darker than in the TV series. There is a lot more violence, there's a lot more dark, kind of touchy scenes. And while the TV series is quite well-rounded, quite balanced in that regard. Like, it is a pretty brutal show, but apparently it doesn't go too far. It's not too cringy, too horrific. The comics go very far into this, and some people have said it's too far, you can't read it sensibly, but other people say that's kind of the point, that's the author's style. So everyone seems to have their own opinion on that one. But in the comic books, the boys are this group of CIA-funded superheroes, or superpowered individuals, and they are basically charged with killing or, eradicating any superheroes that end up stepping out of line. Whereas the TV series has the boys as kind of the opposite sort of thing. They are more or less against the government, they're against big superhero, and most importantly, I think, they are, at least not until the later series, they are not superpowered. So they are a bunch of regular dudes. They, outwit these superheroes. They outmaneuver them, outskill them, and they do it not because they're CIA funded, but for their own personal reasons. And yeah, I think I tend to prefer the TV series version of this. Just the idea of them basically being unpowered individuals, them being underdogs, having to outmaneuver, outsmart these, superpowered individuals. I think that reads a lot better as a story, because as I said in the comic books, these individuals, these boys, are honestly some of the most powerful people in the entire series. So I think it kind of takes away a little bit from the suspense of it, but that might just be me. Looking to the West is an alternate timeline written by Thomas Anderson, and it is one of the longest lasting, longest surviving alternate timelines out there. I mean, I say longest surviving like it's thousands of years old or something, but no, like most alternate timelines, they write in them for a few months, maybe a few years, and then it just kind of dies off, they stop writing. But this one has been going on for a good few years. It diverges from our timeline in 1727, when the soon-to-be King of England, George II, literally ends up just falling over at his coronation. Basically, one of the guys there plays, the wrong note on one of the songs. George gets surprised by this because he's not expecting it. He ends up tripping over, falling over, and his son ends up laughing at his fall. And George takes this so personally that he basically exiles his son and, sends him over to live his life in America, which, like, what the hell? So a very minor, honestly, quite boring point of divergence. Like, I don't think anyone is lying awake at night or, staying up late with their buddies, being like, what I've always wondered, what if George II of England actually fell over during his coronation? And everyone's like, oh, that's mad, I've never thought about that. So yeah, the point of divergence is, I think, a little plain, but it does butterfly with some, more changes, some bigger changes further down the road. It would take me days and hours and videos to explain all of the changes in this timeline, because as I said, it's quite a long timeline. There's a ton of detail in it. It's really well written. But as a few changes, Napoleon ends up growing up in Britain instead of France, and he doesn't go by Napoleon, he ends up going by Leo Bone, which is a pretty rad name. Britain actually loses the Battle of Trafalgar. The US Civil War does still happen, just, with a lot more racism, and most countries, most political systems end up slightly changing in some way or the other. But yeah, I think for this one, you really need to love history. As I said, it's a lot to read. There's a lot of detail, a lot of depth in it, which if you love history, if you're a history buff, history nerd, absolutely check it out. But if you want a more silly, maybe time travel-y one, light-hearted one, or just one that's easier to consume and read, this might not be the one for you. Zippang is a manga set in an alternate timeline in Japan, where it's basically the same timeline, but a Japanese navy force from the year 2000 ends up, through some time traveling means, getting sent back 60 years to World War II. They're out on this little excursion, little training exercise with the Americans, and all of a sudden they lose contact with their other ships. So it's very strange. They're kind of lost, they're bopping around in the ocean, they can't really see or contact anyone, and then they detect another ship out there and they're like, oh, thank God we finally found them. Except this other ship is the Yamato, which is this huge Japanese battleship that actually sunk in 1945. They soon see, other World War II ships pop up, and they manage to evade and escape from these other ships. And the whole series, the whole alternate timeline, is basically like one big moral dilemma. You see, they're obviously stuck here in the past, and a ton of the dialogue is questioning whether they should go back to Japan, whether they should help out Japan during World War II, tell them of the upcoming US attacks. And since this modern Japanese Navy force has obviously a modern ship, modern technology, modern information, if they joined forces with the World War II Japan, they could arguably win the war. It's not entirely certain if just one modern ship would actually be able to do that, but they would definitely be able to hold their own and maybe to influence the outcome of the war. But they basically come to the conclusion that the Japan that they grew up in, or at least the one they knew from the modern era, isn't really the same one that was in World War II. As it was ruled by different people, by very militaristic, brutal warlords. And yeah, it's kind of like modern Germany going back to World War II to fight for Germany. Even modern day Germans, I don't think would support Germany in World War II. At least not, that super evil group of Germans. So yeah, that's basically the decision they come to. They decide to just go home, to try really hard not to change anything, but they do feel pity for this Japanese naval officer. They end up saving him, and then by saving him, this does end up changing things. So a pretty simple idea, I think, not hyper realistic, as again with these time travel things, they don't normally change one thing in the past, but rather they just travel to the past, and the thing that changes is that they now exist in the past. So yeah, not super realistic, but it does look like a super fun manga if you want to check it out. Steamboy is an alternate timeline, an anime timeline once again, where in Europe in the 1800s things are a lot more technologically advanced, but particularly when it comes to steam-powered stuff. So steam weapons, steam trains, steam engines, just steam. So in this timeline, Lloyd Steam and his son, which I swear to God that's his name, Lloyd Steam and his son find this like super pure water, like the purest of waters, and with this pure water they can create pure steam, and they build these like little steam balls, these little steam devices that can, in theory at least, create unlimited steam for the entire world. But there is an accident with the steam, badly injuring and nearly killing Lloyd's son Eddie, which is very sad. So Lloyd kind of goes into hiding. He takes one of these spheres away from, whoever captured them, and he ends up sending it to his grandson Ray Steam. And to make a long story short, he ends up getting captured by these bad people who want to use this steam powered, these balls that they invented, and they essentially want to keep this technology for themselves, keep it from the people, and they're willing to kill over this. But spoiler alert, the good guys end up coming out on top over this, and Ray Steam ends up becoming like a superhero that is powered by a steam jetpack. So it's all pretty cool, but as with the last one, it's not too much of an alternate timeline. I guess the what if might be what if Europe developed more advanced steam technology, and also what if Europe was an anime? Yeah, I'm not really too sure on this one. Family Guy, back to the pilot episode. So if you like Family Guy, or at least the earlier series, like the later seasons kind of fell off quite hard in my opinion, but if you like early Family Guy, this one is absolutely fantastic. And before I spoil it, I would recommend just going and watching it. It takes a few minutes, and yeah, it's a fantastic episode that I massively enjoyed. But anyway, Stewie and Brian end up going back to the 31st of January 1999, which is the exact date that the very first episode of Family Guy aired. And there is the plot line of the episode, which I'll get into in a little bit, but a lot of the episode is just Stewie and Brian commenting on strange things from the past. So, strange editing errors from the first episode, strange plot errors, different ways that people reacted, different characters that never really made it through the, first few episodes, and just how insanely different of a character, for example, Stewie actually was.
The fruition of my deeply laid plans to escape from that cursed Ovarian Bastille. Return the device, woman.
Jeez, what'd you carry a thesaurus around with you?
Which, yeah, Mwah, fantastic episode. But with time travel involved, things obviously get a little bit messy. Future Brian ends up telling past Brian about 9/11 and, tries to get him to stop it, to prevent it, which he does do, but because 9/11 never happened, there is less sympathy for George Bush, and so he ends up losing the 2004 presidential election, and because he loses, he travels back down to the south and basically starts a new US civil war, and this results in nuclear war between the north and the south, and so when Brian and Stewie come back to the future, the world is like an apocalyptic wasteland. So they have to go back in time to stop that, and the changes they make do stop that, except when they go back this time, Brian ends up telling his past self about the entire plot to Harry Potter, and so instead of J.K. Rowling writing Harry Potter, instead now Brian has written Harry Potter. So Stewie is like, oh, Jesus Christ, Brian, and they have to go back in time again, and yeah, they do eventually end up more or less fixing the timeline, but it is super fun leading up to that point. I won't spoil the actual ending, but it doesn't really matter much to the plot or to the timeline. But yeah, if you like early Family Guy, I would highly recommend checking this one out. Amerindian Arbalists, or Cross My Heart, This Is My Crossbow, an allo-historical tale of the Amerindian Arbalists, which, that just rolls right off the tongue. But this alternate timeline explores the question of what if the Native Americans, what if they simply invented the crossbow rather than just stalling at the bow and arrow? Now, when we're comparing crossbows to regular bow and arrows, the crossbow is superior in very, very many ways. And while it's not superior in every way, obviously these situations where it's better to use a regular bow, I'm sure the Native Americans would just use a regular bow, but where it benefited them to use a crossbow, which is honestly in most situations, this would essentially have given them a, greater edge against the Europeans. And I'm not saying it would give them a complete edge, because the Europeans also would have invented crossbows. And obviously the Europeans actually came with, actual firearms. But basically the crossbow can, hold much more tension than a bow can, and so it fires out faster, it's more accurate, it has in some cases a lot more range, and you often use a lot less energy and physical strain while using them, and they require a lot less training to be fairly decent at them. So as you can imagine, if crossbows were invented in the Americas, in this timeline at least, it explores different types of crossbows that they used, from regular handheld ones with different cranks and different frames, all the way up to giant ones that are used to shoot down the dragons in Game of Thrones. But since the Native Americans weren't really up to speed with metals or properly smelting, this timeline has them using mainly wooden ones, which obviously can't hold as much power in them, as if you keep cranking up a wooden one, it will eventually just snap, but they are still a lot more powerful than regular wooden crossbows nonetheless. And so because in this timeline they have crossbows, they're able to fight off a little better against the European settlers, and so they're able to hold on to a lot more of their land, a lot more of their wealth, and so the Native Americans, not just the, American Indians, but also the Aztecs, the Incas, basically any indigenous people, they have a lot more territory, a lot more land, and a lot more wealth than they do in our timeline. SCP-444, Bush vs. Gore, is... okay, this is a massive outlier in this list, I think, because it's not really an alt timeline so much as it's just an SCP, which, if you haven't heard of them, SCPs are fantastic, and I'm actually preparing to do a SCP Iceberg soon enough. But this SCP-4444 is a creature or entity, I guess, that is shaped like a invisible pyramid that can only be seen with infrared light, and its aim as an entity, as a species, is to basically infect the mind of the most powerful thing on a planet in a system, and then while it's controlling this being, it basically uses them to increase greenhouse gases to such an extent that it destroys the entire planet. So yeah, a very strange specific entity. And so this SCP entry says that it basically came down to Earth with the plan to invade the mind of the President of the United States, and then obviously to destroy the planet with greenhouse gases. But it confused the President with the Vice President for some reason, and so it invaded the head of Al Gore, who was Vice President back in the 1990s. And so this entry says that is why Al Gore ran for the presidency in the year 2000, because it was actually this entity that wanted to become president, and then once it was president, it would be able to, do greenhouse gas stuff. But the SCP Foundation detected this, they worked with the CIA and the FBI, and yeah, they supported George Bush in order to prevent Al Gore becoming president, in order to prevent this SCP from getting power. And yeah, as you know, George Bush did win the election, so this entry says that this SCP entity creature thing was stopped. And yeah, I don't really know how to even fathom this one. Like, it's so far from an actual timeline or alt history that I don't even know if it should be included in the list, but it is in the list, and I have covered it. And I suppose maybe it can be considered a trailer for the full SCP Iceberg coming up soon in cinemas near you, but yeah, moving on. Venusian Haven is an alt history where Venus, everyone's favorite little hyper-hot, deadly, sulfuric acid gas cloud-covered planet, has another planet roughly 4.5 billion years ago come down, flying along and smashing into Venus. This, as you might imagine, completely changes the course of our solar system, and when this other planet smashes into Venus, it creates, you know, a moon, as normally happens, and as actually happened with our planet. But this moon basically helps Venus develop into a habitable planet, you know, with a normal atmosphere. So from this, water settles there and actually stays there. Electromagnetic fields form around the planet. With this water comes life, comes greenery, comes animals, trees, fish, bugs, iPhones. Well, maybe not iPhones, but, you know, life. And the early days aren't too much different to our timeline. You know, eventually astronomers do spot Venus like they did in our timeline. They also spot Venus's moon, they track it. But in this timeline, they actually end up flying out there, with the Soviets being the first people to actually land on Venus. And soon after this, more and more people actually land on there. They start populating Venus. And in 2001, all of these nations declare independence from Earth. And this is as the Confederation of Kamchatka, which ends up being the first nation on Venus. And yeah, over time, loads of nations end up sending people up onto Venus, both before and after they declared their independence. The population of Venus and all the nations continue to grow. And yeah, you get all of these cool nations with these cool flags, which you can check out here. And I mean, I love a good flag, but it's not really a historical alt history, I don't think. You know, the point of divergence happened before history in a way. So it is closer to maybe something like sci-fi, you know, asking what if Venus were a habitable planet, basically. And so yeah, if you like sci-fi, if you like alternate timelines, space travel, planet mapping, that sort of thing, absolutely give this one a little look over. Afterfall Insanity. So this is a video game where World War II goes quite a bit differently than it does in our timeline. So in this timeline, Germany ends up developing a nuke, and they use it on the Soviet Union, who is advancing towards them. And naturally, you know, truce talks are discussed. Germany doesn't want the Soviets invading them. The Soviets don't want Germany to bomb them anymore, and things go more or less okay. You have like Germany, the Soviets, Poland, the United States, and the United Kingdom all roughly coming to some peace agreement, although everyone is still like super sus of one another. And this susness leads to tensions, and these tensions eventually lead to another massive war. Because of this, in 2011, Germany basically releases a nuclear weapon, and this is a very large bomb named Entropy, and they detonate it over the English Channel. And from there, obviously everything kicks off, and people either go deep underground, or they unfortunately perish. And Afterfall takes place in a world where decades after this war takes place, the people who survived, who are deep below the ground in these vaults, they are basically fighting to survive against themselves, against their vault members, and against, you know, just sanity and whatever else might be lurking down there. So yeah, a pretty surface level, if you'll excuse the pun, game or timeline. You know, it doesn't go super deep into the details because it is more of a game than like, you know, an actually written out timeline, but it does sound like a pretty cool one nonetheless. 1/6, the graphic novel issue number 1. What if the attack on the US Capitol succeeded? So whether you think that January 6th was a patriotic protest, or an actual insurrection attempt, or a mostly peaceful guided tour of the Capitol, or just a bunch of idiots causing chaos and destruction, that is up for you guys to decide. I won't really get into that whole issue. So in this timeline, Trump ends up taking over the entirety of America in like a fascist dictatorship. And honestly, it's a bit over the top, I think, a bit on the nose. Like, this is just days after this has happened, and somehow Trump has taken over the entire military, the entire government, and the police forces, and controls all the media, just like everything. And he has a golden statue of himself installed holding what looks to be a Trump Bible or something. All the tanks are rebranded with T's for Trump. The new flag is like, what, the Confederate flag, I'm guessing? Like, doesn't Trump actually love the regular flag? Isn't that like his whole thing, that he loves America? Like, I don't know why he'd use the Confederate flag for this. And the symbol in the center of this flag seems to represent the, bad guys from World War II, which again, I don't know why Trump would use a symbol like this. If anything, he would use his own symbol that he, came up with. He wouldn't recycle something like this. But I guess the author clearly wants to make a point about what he thinks about Trump, and so this is his way of expressing that. Like, if Trump did take over, wouldn't he just put like American flags everywhere? But yeah, this all seems like a, I don't know, panicky kind of fever dream about all the worst things that might possibly happen. But as I said, it reads kind of very differently. It's not like an actual political, historical, prediction about what might happen. It seems very on the nose, very exaggerated, very cartoonish almost. But that's the alternate timeline, so yeah, moving on. The Day After is a 1983 film that is, well, the cover at least is super interesting. And it helps, I think, give a general vibe about this type of timeline. It says, "They told us it would be impossible for us to make this movie. They told us it would be impossible for you to watch it. We hope nothing is impossible. The Day After." Amazing. But this is a timeline in which NATO and the Warsaw Pact end up fighting quite badly over East and West Germany, which, ends in a nuclear war. And it's a fairly realistic, fairly dark series of events. The bombs go off, people end up finding shelter wherever they can. There is death and radiation and injury almost everywhere. Cities destroyed, radioactive wastelands. And that's really just when the bombs go off. After that, you have looting, you have some other, unmentionable things. You have chaos, you have people starving, you have corrupt politicians, or I should rephrase that, more corrupt than, the regular politician, which is already quite corrupt, but that's a discussion for another time. But yeah, a super brutal, super harsh film to watch, and the film just ends with a fade to black, with the voice of a man asking if anyone can still hear him, and then it's just silence until the credits. So yeah, super eerie but super realistic film. And there are some versions of the film with a disclaimer around the credits that says basically this entire film is just fictional, and if this actually happened in real life, it would be much worse than the film. So it's a bit of a bait and switch there. So yeah, I've said before on this channel that I do kind of like these super realistic films, regarding nuclear war, nuclear weapons, because I think it's a good way to show people just like the sheer hell that will be unleashed on the entire world if anything like this were to happen. And yeah, hopefully nothing like this ever does. World War Zero is a pretty cool looking timeline or game where World War I basically never ended. So it started in 1914, and now 50 years later it is still going on. Western Europe has united as one big kind of coalition. Mongolia is a lot stronger than in our timeline. Russia is still a monarchy and has somewhat teamed up with Mongolia. So yeah, it's a pretty wild timeline. It's a pretty good game, apparently. It's a pretty interesting concept. It's a nice twist on the, usual World War I or World War II games, or what would happen if they went slightly differently. But I haven't yet seen what would happen if World War I was still actually going on. The Atlantropa Articles. So this explores a timeline where in the 1930s, there is a plan, and hear me out here, but the plan is to build these huge dams on like either side of the Mediterranean Sea. So you got one here, you got one here, and then to drain the entire sea. So yeah, this is a bit bonkers so far. And then with the new land that emerges with the, drained sea, that can be used for living, for farming, for all sorts. And so it is a pretty decent idea. The project takes like 50 years. It's finally finished in the 1980s. But what is projected to be a, utopia for everyone, gives everyone in Europe and the Mediterranean more space, more land to actually do stuff, it actually just ends up with more chaos and mayhem. The timeline that you experience in this alternate timeline is set thousands of years in the future, where all of these Mediterranean lands that were underneath the Mediterranean Sea, all of that basically just forms this desert now. And this desert is super hot. It's known as the Kiln, and basically nothing can live there. Oh, and all of Southern Europe is now controlled by Nazis. So yeah, fun. American Dad, episode 9, season 2, the best Christmas story never told. So this one kind of reminds me of the Family Guy time traveling one, where instead of going back in time to the first episode, Stan basically in the present is upset with how secular things have got. His character, super Christian, super American, loves guns, all that sort of thing. But he says, oh, we can't say Happy Christmas anymore. We have to say Happy Holidays. You can't even put up a Christmas tree because it's offensive. And he basically ends up blaming Jane Fonda for all this, because he said she inspired the hippies with her liberal nonsense. And the hippies then went on to basically, in his eyes, create this liberal hellscape. And yeah, so then he ends up destroying the Christmas tree and a bunch of presents. He gets told off by Francine. He ends up going to sleep. And during that night, the fairy of Christmas past comes to him, and she basically brings him back in time to show him, the error of his ways. And Stan, in perfect American Dad fashion, ends up going missing in the past. Like, he basically runs away because, he's a CIA agent. He evades the fairy and she has no idea where he's gone. And so the fairy's like, I can't find him. She goes back to the future to tell Francine, and then she and Francine go back to the past to try and locate Stan. And Stan's plan in the past is he's basically hellbent on tracking down Jane Fonda and, ending her, and by doing this he thinks he will restore Christmas. So he tracks down Jane Fonda. He finds out that it was actually Donald Sutherland who got Jane into politics, and so he basically just decides to cut out the middleman and just kill Sutherland instead of Fonda. But he doesn't really get a chance to. The fairy and Francine end up appearing and taking him back to the future. But in the past, before Francine took him away, he did track down Sutherland, and he tracked him down at this big kind of Hollywood party. And at the party, he met Martin Scorsese, who, among other things, made Taxi Driver. And Stan basically, in passing, convinces him to, ease up on the wacky tobacco, the devil's flower sort of thing. And when they get back to the future, it is just complete madness. The town is just barren, empty. There are Soviet tanks driving around everywhere. And what basically happened was Stan convinced Martin to ease up on, that sort of stuff. So Scorsese starts taking less of it, and as a result, he doesn't make Taxi Driver. And because he doesn't make Taxi Driver, Jodie Foster never obviously appears in the film. And because she never appears in the film, a man named John Hinckley never gets obsessed with her. And Hinckley was the man who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan in 1981, and the reason he gave for this was because he was obsessed with Jodie Foster and he basically wanted to impress her. And so, because all of that never happens and Ronald Reagan ends up not going through the assassination attempt, then people are less sympathetic towards him. He ends up losing the 1984 election, and he loses to Walter Mondale, who, once he's elected, ends up basically surrendering the United States to Soviet Russia. So yeah, that is one hell of a timeline. So they go back in time to try and fix this. Stan decides to basically make Taxi Driver himself, which still doesn't fix the future, and the fairy of Christmas past basically tells Stan that the only way to fix the future is for Stan to shoot Ronald Reagan himself. And Stan doesn't want to do it because he says that's his favorite president, but ultimately he does actually do it. They do go back to the future and things are more or less fixed, with only one really minor change. So the fairy gets Stan a Christmas present, and this present is a brand new gun, which it's like so Stan. And he is a bit confused because you normally need to wait like a week to receive any gun that you buy. And this was introduced in the 1990s and they called it the Brady Bill. And this was named after James Brady, who was shot in the Ronald Reagan shooting. And so they brought in this bill to say, we should put some time in between when you buy the gun, or when you're authorized to buy the gun, and when you actually receive the gun. And so since Stan only shot Ronald Reagan in the past, the Brady Bill never happened, and you can now get guns, instantly. Which, of course, Stan sees it as like, That's the perfect America, and it is kind of a fun ending to a great episode. The towers still stand. So this takes place in a timeline where the 9/11 attacks basically fail, and, if you will, the towers still stand. And the timeline basically takes us through them trying to stop these terrorists continuing their attack. Because as we all know, the bad guys never just stop after one attempt. And this attempt was disguised because the planes actually hit into each other and not the towers, and so nobody really knows that these towers were their target. It's written kind of like a suspense, like a thriller novel, where a few people know about the bad guys' intentions and their plans, and they're trying to get people to believe them so that they can thwart their future attacks. But yeah, it brings up a good question about what might have happened if these attacks never took place. Would Bush have been re-elected in 2004? Who knows? Would the US have invaded Iraq? Also, who knows? But yeah, an interesting one to think about. Star Trek: A New Beginning. So this is a bit of a wild, bit of a nerdy alt history timeline in which our Earth from our universe in 2011 swaps places with the Star Trek version of Earth, which is actually in 2063 after World War III. And that is basically it. This is apparently a very fan-heavy, kind of self-serving timeline. So if you like inside jokes and references, if you like all things Star Trek, there are a ton of, as I said, inside jokes, references, rule of cool type stuff. You know, the humans end up going to war with the Vulcans. Soon enough, the whole of Earth ends up uniting and teams up with the Romulans and the Andorians. And yeah, as I said, super nerdy stuff. I was personally never really into Star Trek, if I'm honest. I was always a more Lord of the Rings sort of guy, less so into space stuff. But hey, you do you, space nerds. Napoleon Victorious, an alternate history of the Battle of Waterloo. So this is an alt history written by Peter G. Tsoras, or just Tsoras, which explores what the world would have looked like had Napoleon actually not lost the Battle of Waterloo. In our timeline, he basically lost the battle, and that more or less resulted in him losing his power and more or less the end of the French Empire. So if Napoleon had, maneuvered his pieces slightly differently, if he started a battle a few days earlier or a few days later than he actually did, maybe if the weather had been slightly different, maybe more windy, more rainy, whatever, things might have gone very differently. This timeline is very historical based. It's very well written and goes into the actual militaristic maneuvers and the armies and that sort of thing. And yeah, it seems like if a few things did actually go different, perhaps he could have won the war. But there was the, oncoming Austrian and Russian empires or armies. So the other question is whether he could have fought them off as well, or whether even after winning the Battle of Waterloo, if he would have just lost to them anyway. So yeah, a great timeline and a especially interesting one if you are a history buff. And that is all we have time for. These iceberg entries seem to be getting longer and longer as we get further and further down into the iceberg. There is only one part left of this iceberg, and it will be quite a doozy, I believe. So if you are enjoying this, feel free to, like the video, let me know down in the comments below, and subscribe so you don't miss the finale of this alternate history iceberg. This is Connor, signing off, and I don't know why I said that, I never end a video like that. But regardless, as always, thanks for watching.